Hello everyone, I know you are watching this video to accompany your sleep. So, if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also don't forget to tell me where you are from, and what time you watched this video. When I was in 3rd grade, my life felt as close to perfect as a kid could ask for. My parents were still together, and they seemed genuinely happy at the time. Not like fake happy that you see in movies, but actually happy. My older sister and I got along most of the time, even though she could be annoying and mean. We had a nice house, went on vacations, and I had everything I could want. Honestly, I didn't even know how lucky I was. You don't learn that kind of thing until you grow up. Everything felt safe and normal. At least, it did until that one night. It was late. I don't remember the exact time, but I had been dreaming about something. I can't even remember what it was, but then I just woke up. Just like that. You know that feeling when you're falling in a dream, and it just jolts you awake? It was like that. At first, everything seemed fine, but then I saw him, my 3rd grade teacher. He was standing in my room, just standing there, staring at me. At first, I thought maybe I was still dreaming. It didn't make any sense. Why would he be here? But he didn't disappear when I blinked, and the longer that I looked, the more real it felt. He didn't say anything. He didn't even move. He just stood there, completely still, staring at me with this blank, almost calm expression. His eyes, though, made my skin crawl. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just lay there frozen while my chest got tight and my breath came in short, shaky gasps. My brain was screaming to do something, anything, but my body wasn't listening. He just kept watching me like I was some kind of science experiment he was studying. Finally, when I couldn't take it anymore, I started crying. It wasn't loud. I was too scared to make noise, but the tears started pouring out and I could not stop. That's when he moved. He turned, walked to my window, opened it like it was no big deal, and climbed out. But the weirdest part? He put the screen back on before he disappeared into the night. I don't even know how he did it. A few seconds later, my dad came into the room. "What's the matter?" he asked, rubbing his eyes like he had just rolled out of bed. I tried to explain, but the words came out in this jumbled mess of crying and hiccuping. I pointed at the window, but of course, there was no one there. No sign of anything, just the moonlight shining through the glass. My dad checked the window, and then shook his head. "You must have had a nightmare, buddy. There's no way anyone came in here. Everything's fine. Just go back to sleep." But it wasn't fine. I knew it wasn't a nightmare. My mom came in and tried to calm me down, brushing my hair back and telling me everything was fine. But I saw the look she gave my dad, that one that said, "What's wrong with him?" The next day at school, I couldn't stop staring at my teacher. He acted completely normal, like nothing had happened. He handed out worksheets, explained math problems, and didn't look at me even once. For most of the day, I started to wonder if maybe my parents were right. Maybe I had imagined it. But then, right before the bell rang, I glanced up from the paper airplane I was coloring, and he was staring right at me. His face was still, but there was this tiny, almost invisible grin at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a happy smile. It was wrong, like he knew something nobody else did. My hands started shaking. The bell saved me, though, and I grabbed my stuff and bolted. That night, I tried to stay awake. I told myself there was no way I was going to fall asleep, not with him showing up in my room. But I was 8 years old, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't fight it. I passed out, and when I woke up again, it was to the feeling of someone sitting on my bed. I opened my eyes, and there he was, my teacher, sitting crisscross applesauce at the foot of my bed, staring at me. His expression hadn't changed, and neither had that creepy little grin. This time, for some reason, I wasn't as scared, and I whispered, "Well, why are you here?" He didn't answer. He just put his finger to his lips and made a soft shhh sound, telling me to keep quiet. Then he got up, walked to the window, opened it, put the screen back on again, closed the window, and disappeared just like before. I told my parents again the next morning, but again they didn't believe me. "You've got to stop watching those scary movies," my dad said as he poured cereal. My mom just sighed, and told me I needed to stop letting my imagination run wild. After that, I stopped trying to convince them. This went on for months. Every couple of weeks, he would show up in my room, sometimes 2 or 3 nights in a row. Sometimes he would just stand there, sometimes he would be sitting on my bed. He never touched me, never said anything beyond shhh. And then one day it stopped when I started 4th grade, and I got a new teacher. No more late night visits. But I still saw him in the hallway sometimes, and every now and then, he'd catch my eye and give me that same small grin. It wasn't as scary in the daylight, but it still made my stomach hurt. Now I'm in high school, and I still wonder if I made the whole thing up sometimes. But I don't think I did. It feels too real. Even now, sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me, waiting for me to wake up. This is a story my mom told me once, and honestly, it creeps me out whenever I think about it. It happened years before I was born, back when she was in her early 20s, living alone in a small house on the edge of town. It was a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where people didn't bother locking their doors most of the time. She thought nothing bad could ever happen there. After this, though, I think she changed her mind. One evening, she was expecting a friend to come over. It wasn't anything special, just a casual hangout, maybe dinner, maybe some TV. My mom decided to hop in the shower before her friend arrived, figuring she would have plenty of time to freshen up. But just in case her friend got there while she was still in the bathroom, she left a note on the front door. It said, "I'm in the shower, come on in." Simple enough, right? She said she always thought it was funny how trusting she used to be back then. These days, the thought of leaving your front door open with an invitation like that seems insane. But back then it felt normal. Anyway, she taped the note to the door and went about her business. The shower was one of those old ones with the loud water pressure that drowns out every other noise in the house. My mom was halfway through rinsing her hair when she heard it. A knock on the bathroom door. Not on the front door, the bathroom door. She froze for a second, a little startled, but not scared. It was her friend. She obviously showed up. She saw the note. She just wanted to let her know she was there. "I'll be right out," my mom called, loud enough to be heard over the water. There was no response, but she didn't think much of it. She assumed they would just sit in the living room or the kitchen and wait for her. She finished her shower a few minutes later, dried off and got dressed. But when she stepped out into the hallway, something felt off. The house was completely silent. No voices, no footsteps, no sign that anyone had arrived. She glanced into the living room. Empty. The kitchen. Empty. She checked the front door, and sure enough, it was still unlocked. The note was still there, like nobody had touched it. Her stomach sank. She called out, "Hello." Her voice echoed back at her, and that's when she started to feel uneasy. The house wasn't that big, and it wouldn't take that long to check every room. She peeked into the guest room, then her own room, then the tiny laundry room in the back. Nothing. Nobody. She walked back to the bathroom, almost on autopilot, and stared at the door. It was a plain wooden door, old but sturdy. She reached out and touched it, her hand hovering near the knob. She told me later that she half expected it to still be warm, like someone had just been leaning against it. But it wasn't. It was cold. Trying to shake off the weird feeling, she went to the living room and sat on the couch, grabbing her book to distract herself. She convinced herself she had imagined it. Maybe the water pressure had caused some weird noise that sounded like a knock. Or maybe it was the pipes. That's what she told herself anyway. But she couldn't quite shake the tension in her chest. About 10 minutes later, headlights swept across the window. Finally, her friend was there. She got up and opened the door. And there they were, stepping out of their car with a smile. As her friend came inside, my mom tried to play it cool. "Hey, did you knock on the bathroom door when you came in?" Her friend gave her a confused look. "I just got here. What are you talking about?" My mom froze. "You didn't come in earlier at all?" "No. You just saw me pull up." "Why?" My mom didn't answer right away. She said later that she didn't want to freak her friend out, so she just laughed it off and said, "I thought I heard something. Must have just been my imagination, I guess." But she couldn't stop thinking about it. If it wasn't her friend that had come in earlier, who was it? After her friend left that night, my mom double-checked every lock in the house. She even wedged a chair under the doorknob, something she had only ever seen people do in movies. For weeks after that, she could not shake the feeling, like she was constantly being watched. Every time she took a shower, she would lock the bathroom door, even if she was home alone. She never got an answer to what happened that night. Nobody else had a key to the house, and there was no sign of anyone breaking in or touching anything. But she swears she heard that knock clear as day. And I believe her. It still makes me wonder, though, if it wasn't her friend, who was it? Years ago, back when we thought we were invincible, my two friends and I decided to go camping in the fall. We were 15, stupid, and thought that we were Bear Grylls, that we could do anything. Of course, this wasn't some super prepared expedition. We threw a small tent, some chips, maybe some soda, some water, into the back seat of my friend's dad's old car. We were headed to a campground deep in the Pacific Northwest woods. You know, one of those places where the fog rolls in like a movie set, and there's no cell phone service. At all. Good decision-making was not our strong suit. By the time we got the tent set up, it was already dark. We had one flashlight between the three of us, which meant a lot of tripping and swearing as we got situated. The tent was just big enough for the three of us, if none of us moved or breathed. We staggered our setup in the tent, two of us with our heads on one side, and the third guy's head down by our feet, because the tent didn't quite make the fit three adults promise on the box. The night was silent. And by silent, I mean creepily silent. No crickets, no owls, not even the wind. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. That should have been our first sign to get out of there, but no. We were adventurous, I guess you could say. Adventurous idiots. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was part of a dream. A muffled voice, like someone talking on a cell phone in another room. Except we weren't in a room, and there was no one else around. "Hello? Can you hear me? Hello?" the voice said. My heart stopped. I lay there, staring up at the tent ceiling, trying to convince myself that I hadn't heard it. Then it came again. "Hello? Can you hear me?" I turned my head and whispered, Guys, are you awake?" My friend next to me immediately hissed. "Are you hearing that?" We sat up so fast, the tent nearly collapsed. My other friend, who was down by our feet, shot up too, his hair sticking out like he had been electrocuted. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. We all froze, listening. The voice came again, clear as day. "Hello? Can you hear me?" And it was coming from the middle of the tent, right between our heads. Now let me tell you, there's nothing like sheer terror to make three teenage boys lose their minds. We scrambled around the tent like maniacs, throwing blankets, shaking out pillows, patting down every inch of or a speaker or something, anything that would make that noise. But there was nothing there. It was just us, sitting there in our socks and PJs, and panic. The voice saying, "Hello? Can you hear me? Hello?" I turned to my friend across the tent. "Wait a second, what did you hear?" It sounded like someone was saying, "Hello? Can you hear me?" "Same," said my other friend. "Dude, it was right here." He pointed to the middle of the tent, where our heads had been. We all just stared at each other, trying to process what was happening. Then just like that, the voice stopped. Silence again. Thick, heavy silence. The kind that makes your ears ring, because there's nothing else to hear. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. We just packed up as fast as we could and bolted for that car. None of us even wanted to talk about it, but you could tell we were all thinking the same thing. What the hell was that? As we threw our stuff into the car, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. All our phones were still sitting on the back seat, exactly where we had left them the night before. None of them had been in the tent. And of course, none of them had any signal. We just stood there, staring at the phones like they were cursed. Finally, my friend broke the silence. "Okay," he said, "so either one of you has a speaker hidden somewhere, or..." He trailed off, his face pale. None of us laughed. To this day, I don't know what happened. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe it was some weird sound carrying through the fog. Or maybe the woods were just screwing with us for fun. All I know is that I have never gone camping again without triple checking my gear and my sanity. And every time someone says, "Hello? Can you hear me?" on a phone call, I get a little chill that runs down my spine. I remember seeing the house for the first time. I was a child of 7. My young parents had just bought their first home. I remember hating living in the cramped, dingy apartment we previously inhabited, and opening the door to our new home with wide-eyed wonder. It blew my young mind how spacious this house was. I went upstairs to scope out my bedroom. I was so excited that I was getting my own room and didn't have to share with my infant brother. On my grand tour of my new digs, I finally made it down to our basement. The basement was nothing like the rest of the house. The upstairs was elegant and classy. The basement was cold, metallic, sterile, and stinky. The ceiling was lined with ancient pipes winding in grotesque angles. The floor was covered in rough cement. I recall taking a look at the stairs for the first time and being immediately struck by how odd they were. The stairs were surrounded by drywall, which clashed with the rest of the basement. One particular section of the wall was colored differently than the rest. It stood out like a sore thumb. I inched closer to it and felt the texture of it. It felt very strange. I then knocked on it. A hollow sound pervaded the empty air of the basement. Something about that sound immediately put me ill at ease. I walked up the stairs as I could hear the same hollow sound echo in the emptiness of the basement. As we settled into our new home, I began to get comfortable with my surroundings. The house began to feel familiar. Everywhere, that is, except for the basement. It just always put me off, and I avoided going down there as best as I could. Our family couldn't be happier. My loving father and mother doted over me and my little brother. My life was perfect. Then it began. I would hear errant noises. When I pointed them out to my parents, they told me the old standby, that the house was settling. One night in particular indicated that something wasn't right. I snuck downstairs to the kitchen for a late night snack. As I closed the refrigerator, I heard a tapping sound cut through the silence of the night. I craned my head to see if I could pinpoint where the sound was coming from. Dread began to wash over me as I realized that tapping was coming from the basement. I inched my way over to the basement door. I opened it to see the blackness of the depths below. My ears perked up. There was again that hollow tapping sound. The same sound I heard on my initial visit to the basement from hitting the drywall. I turned on the lights, steeling myself to go down the stairs and investigate. The tapping continued as I took the first step. Fear overtook me. I ran back to my room and hid under my covers until the morning light gave way to a new day. I remember walking down the stairs, being the first one up and about. I ran to the living room to play Nintendo. On my way I passed the door to the basement. It was shut. Though I was in a state of near panic when I ran from it the previous night, I distinctly remember leaving my door open and not turning off the lights. I rationalized that my mother or father must have gone down there for some reason, and I lost myself in Super Mario Bros. 3. Later I mentioned the incident to my parents, and they just assured me that what I had heard was the sound of the hot water heater clicking on at night. I knew better, but welcomed a logical explanation. About a month after the move, my mother asked me to run downstairs and grab a load of socks out of the dryer in the basement. I reluctantly told her that I would. It was the middle of the day, and enough time had passed to dull the fear that I had felt a week prior. I turned on the lights. I ran down the stairs. Hearing the hollow sound echo with my footsteps, a cold sweat started to form on me. The smell hit my nose as I reached the last step. I made my way to the dryer and grabbed a basket. I pulled the socks out hastily and shoved them into the basket. After I shut the door to the dryer, I surveyed my surroundings. The stillness of the basement was so eerie. Then I heard it, a faintly audible whisper. At first I thought it was somebody calling from upstairs, their voice scarcely making it down into the basement. However, this was not the case. That sound was coming from the basement, specifically from under the stairs. As I stood frozen with fear, it began to increase in volume, but still remained barely above the threshold of human perception. What was being said, incomprehensible to my young ears. Then it stopped as quickly as it began. I moved toward the stairs, keeping my eye on the oddly colored portion of the drywall. As I took my first step to escape this ever-growing nightmare, the most profoundly terrifying moment of my life occurred. A loud, hollow bang shook the stairs, almost knocking me to the ground. I ran up the stairs as fast as my legs would carry me. Through tears and shaking uncontrollably, I told my parents what happened. They tried their best to calm me, but nothing they said could ease my mind. I told them in no uncertain terms that I would never go down to the basement again. They must have been convinced of how terrified I was, because they honored my request and never sent me down there again. After another 3 months in the house, things returned to normalcy for me, and honestly there was about a 2-week period where I was happy again. This would be the last time happiness would exist in my life, or my family's for that matter. One moment in particular comes to mind. I remember lifting up little Jonathan above my head lovingly as his pacifier fell out of his mouth and brushed against my nose. I pulled him in for a big bear hug, and I remember how he smelled, that wonderful smell that only babies emit. I was so content. It all came crashing down for me and my parents the night of July 2nd, 1991. That is the day Jonathan went missing. A ransom note was scrawled in barely legible English and left in his bed, demanding $20,000 in cash. It informed my parents that if they contacted the police, they would kill him. My mother and father took to their room and argued loudly and emotionally over whether or not to call the police, as I listened with tears streaming down my face. My mother eventually wore down my father, and the police were called. Seeing as the location of the drop and time were indicated on the note, the police set up a wiretap, just in case the kidnapper decided to call. I asked my parents and the police if they had thoroughly searched the house, in case he was still there. They assured me that they had, and that Jonathan would be fine after the drop, but the seed of an idea was already growing in my mind. It would blossom throughout the rest of my life. My parents followed the instructions to a T. They dropped off the money, and then waited in the location where they were supposed to pick up Jonathan. He never came. Needless to say, this tore my family apart. As the weeks passed, and there was no news about Jonathan, my young, vibrant parents became husks of their former selves. My mother especially. She blamed herself for getting the police involved, and believed that to be the reason Jonathan was not returned. One night, as she was sobbing alone in shambles, clutching a bottle of wine, I finally decided to divulge to her the theory that had been brewing inside my skull. I told her that I thought it was whoever, or whatever for that matter, was under the stairs that had gotten Jonathan, and that maybe he was still alive. She slapped me across my face so hard that I saw stars. She screamed at me, the guilt expressing itself as rage. She told me to stop the childish crap and just accept that Jonathan was taken out of the house by some sicko, and that he was dead. My childhood died that day. I remember contemplating taking a hammer and exposing whatever was under the stairs myself, but the fear of childhood was just too overwhelming for me to actually do it, let alone step one stair down into that basement. My family moved shortly after this incident. I remember looking to the future with what might resemble optimism, only to have it come crashing down yet again. My parents divorced. The grief was too much to share, and not a year after that, my mother took her own life. The guilt must have just overwhelmed her. My father did his best to raise me, but Jonathan's long shadow always hung over our lives. 20 years later, I began to think long and hard about my little brother's disappearance, and how angry it made me. My family had a chance at a normal and fulfilling life, and it was snuffed out in an instant by whoever took him. I wasn't just robbed of a little brother, I was robbed of any chance of happiness. As I grew up, I accepted the official story of what happened. But lately, curiosity began to get the better of me. I began driving past the old house, seeing that it was currently vacant. Ideas began to swirl in my mind. So, I broke into the house, bolstered by alcohol. I decided to do it, knowing I would likely find nothing under the basement stairs, but hoping that this would close a too long chapter in my life and allow me to finally move on. To my dismay, the stairs sounded exactly the same as I remembered, a hollow sound pervading the emptiness of the basement. I stared at the spot in the drywall, still discolored, still just as ominous as when I was a child. However, fear was not going to stop me now. In fact, I was feeling the opposite. I was feeling a courage I hadn't felt in a long time. The moment of truth was upon me, with all the force within me, emboldened by years of pent-up rage. I ran towards the wall, shoulder first. The drywall came crashing down around me. I opened my eyes as my bravery was immediately eroded and turned into absolute horror. Bones everywhere. My horror increased to unimaginable heights as I surveyed the tight space, seeing the myriad of skeletons strewn about. The light played menacingly on their tiny frames. Tattered pieces of paper were scattered about, with God only knows what written on them. There must have been the remains of 20 to 30 children. My fright reached a crescendo when I realized that with no exceptions, they were all missing their skulls. One particularly tiny one begged for my attention. I became weak in the knees and fell backward when I saw what were unmistakably bite marks up and down the tiny forearm. As I hit the ground, I expected to hear a dull thud as I landed on the concrete. Instead, I heard a hollow sound. I looked to see what I had landed on. A trapdoor. Finding new courage, summoning strength I didn't know I had, I opened it. Below me lay a dark tunnel, a crawl space that could barely fit a person lying on their stomach. The dank smell wafting upward made me reluctant, but I knew what I had to do. Before I was conscious of what my muscles were doing, I found myself crawling through the darkness toward whatever lay on the other side. As I reached the end of the tunnel, I looked up to see a sliver of light cutting through the darkness. With trepidation, I pushed upward. Cautiously, I poked my head up. To my surprise, the tunnel had led to the other side of the stairs. I crawled out to find myself in the corner of the basement, facing the stairs behind a dryer covered in years of dust. The implications of all this sent my mind reeling, but before I could form a coherent thought, the lights turned off in the basement. My heart caught in my throat as I began to hear someone descending the stairs. Slow but sure steps announced I was no longer alone. With every thud, my heart skipped a beat. I began to hear that incomprehensible whispering. The familiarity reignited the fear and woe of my lost childhood. Worrying the darkness would not adequately hide me, I sought cover by ducking behind the dryer, not willing to take the risk of catching a glimpse, though every fiber of my being screamed to do so. Panic began to set in. What am I going to do when he, or whoever it is, discovers his lair has been revealed? While I was mulling over my options, the screaming began. I say scream as a frame of reference, but there is no way to truly describe the guttural noises that I heard. The sounds smashing the silence of the basement were so bone-chilling, so surreal as to defy description. He had clearly discovered his perverse sanctuary had been disturbed. Before I knew it, I was up the stairs running for my life. I made it to my car, too scared to turn around. With all of my muscles working, I opened the door and put the key in the ignition in one swift movement. As my car sprang to life under the streetlight, a shadow fell over my car. I gunned it, never once looking back, flooring the accelerator to the local police precinct. I breathlessly tried to explain to the attending officer what had occurred, and collapsed to the floor mid-sentence. Now it is a month later. The day after my discovery, the police launched an investigation and quickly made the same gruesome discovery. I was thanked profusely by the police and the community for what I had found, with officers telling me they were going to be able to close the books on multiple missing person cases. However, they were not able to find the perpetrator of these heinous crimes. They began to test the DNA of the bodies. A profound sense of relief overcame me when I received the call informing me that one of the tiny skeletons belonged to Jonathan. I shared the news with my father. The look of relief on his face tugged at my heart. The burden he had carried for so many years was lifted. We hugged as tears filled both of our eyes. However, the relief has been short-lived. The thing that keeps me up at night is that whoever did this is still out there. The question that plagues my mind is whether this monster is literal or figurative. Either way, I hope I never find out. I started getting them last night. My ex had taken the kids for half the month, and I was home alone. My apartment was dark and quiet. You might say tomb-like. The TV was on, and the volume down low. I was missing my kids, missing my ex, and despising myself for it. My phone lit up. I had to carefully remove the bowl of vanilla ice cream swimming in vodka from my stomach, lest it tips over. I saw a number I didn't recognize, so I did the sensible thing and ignored it. Then I got the familiar ding, buzz, buzz. One new voicemail. Okay, I thought. I'll bite. The phone number hadn't read scam, likely. It might even be important. The first time I played it back, I couldn't hear it well, but it sounded like numbers. I put it on speakerphone, then cranked up the volume to max. In a crackly drone sounding like a voice recording from the 1980s or earlier, somebody read out these numbers. 04140112180513132119. That was all the message they left. Straight away, I knew it wasn't a phone number. It was too many digits, and they were all spaced out in doubles. I tried to return to my low-effort binge-watching at a low volume, half-heartedly piecing together subtitles. Hours later, I couldn't get it out of my head. I won't tell you the actual phone number that called me, because I'd really rather not, but I did give that number a call back. It was a number with my area code. I called it. It rang so much. I thought I'd be the one to go to voicemail this time. But then came the click. Except for some murmurs of static, it was quiet on the other end. Hello, I said. Somebody left a message from this number. It was all digits, not a phone number, just... I don't know what it was. Clearer now. There's breathing on the other end. Hello. Click again. They had hung up. Brief, but bothersome. I didn't have much time to let it bother me, though, because I got a call back after 10 minutes from that number. I answered, instead of letting it go to voicemail. Whoever it was immediately ended the call. Okay, I thought. That's pretty odd. About another 10 more minutes. Another call. I answered again. Same treatment. As soon as I said hello, they hung up. I didn't answer the next one, because I was using the restroom. That one went to voicemail. I heard the ding buzz as soon as I entered my living room again. Hands clammy, I picked up the phone. Played it back. I kind of expected another weird series of digits. Instead, what I got was this. Hey, what's the strangest thing you've ever seen at a museum? Went to that carnival museum today. You know the one. I saw a costume that reminded me of you. It got me thinking. Anyway, don't want to talk your ear off. Sherry and the kids send their best. We're doing great, and everyone's happy. Can't wait to see you. It was a man's voice, but one I did not recognize. Carnival museum? When did I go to a carnival museum? I tried to remember all the parades I'd ever attended, New Orleans and elsewhere. I couldn't recall stopping in at any carnival museums. Must have me confused with someone else. On the other hand, the voicemails and wordless calls wanted to suggest other things. What those were, I wasn't sure. I glanced around, my TV flickered, but otherwise dark apartment as a chill worked its way too slowly from foot to head like a bad massage. About another 10 minutes, I got another call. I let this one go to voicemail. "You won't believe what happened today," the same man's voice said. JJ, Joey Jr. fell from a tree and broke some stuff. I told that boy about climbing them trees. But get this, that's not even the most unbelievable part. We didn't need to see a doctor. Just gave him some of that ice cream, and he was right as rain, walking just fine. Now there's a little hitch in his step, but it's the kind of thing that adds character. We played some family games, and for you know it, things were back to normal. There I go again. I'm for sure talking your ear off, and I know we'll be seeing each other very soon. We're doing great though, and everyone's happy. This is getting ridiculous, I thought. I tried to pick apart my mind, thinking back on all my old acquaintances. Even if this was someone I knew, there was no way I was planning on meeting or seeing them as those messages suggested. I called the phone number again before another rough 10 minutes could transpire. "Hey, don't hang up. I don't know you or your family. You've got me confused with someone else." Click. At least I had them on the line for a few rushed sentences. The messages continued every rough 10 minutes like clockwork that someone had bashed with a hammer. Anytime I picked up and didn't let it go to voicemail, I was rewarded with the call quickly ending. Every message told some new details of that family's lives. How their daughter Abigail got herself hurt chasing after some cars. How Joey Jr. had tried to eat a cockroach. How Rebecca had to get her wisdom teeth out, and it was a messy experience. How they had all gone shopping for second-hand clothing, so fresh it might have been pulled straight from the backs of others. Even though these messages were spaced out at roughly 10-minute intervals, it seemed he was describing separate days, weeks, and months even. Another strange thing was how, about near the end of each voicemail, the man concluded with, "We're doing great and everyone's happy." When it ate into my sleep, I lost every ounce of my patience. I was scared, but I was also fed up. I gave their number another call. "I don't want to hear how great you are doing," I said, "and how happy you are. Do you hear me?" No more voicemails. Heavy breathing on the other end. Sounded like more than one person doing it. "I'll ask your forgiveness for not going about this earlier. I'm kind of an old soul, at least when it comes to things like technology. I put my phone on silent, and I finally got around to searching that phone number that was calling me online. Seeing if there was anything about it tied to scammers and stuff like that. I didn't find anything online about scammers, but that number was connected to a company that had locations all over. I'm talking about all over the country, and while I won't tell you the name of it, I will tell you that it had the word happiness in it. There wasn't much information online, on the official website or elsewhere. There were some creepy pictures on the official website, oozing happiness and bright monochromes. From the About section, I wasn't sure whether it was supposed to be a pharmaceutical company or some kind of wellness center. While I was doing all that searching, I had received a bunch of voicemails that I hadn't listened to yet. My phone had been on silent mode. Glancing over from my office chair, I noticed soft blue, red, and yellow in bands, with the yellow flowing around the trees. It was like a painted, uncooked Easter egg that had been broken with the yolk spilling out. Made me think of the last Easter I had spent with my family. I had gotten fussy with my ex about using real eggs this time. She had said, "What other eggs are you supposed to paint? They might stink in the sun," I had said. Somehow or other, expletives got flung around. The next thing you know, the kids were crying, throwing their own fits. Next thing you know, the Easter egg hunt was canceled. Like Hemingway describes bankruptcy, it happened gradually, and then suddenly, like the breakup in our marriage. Weird how a sunrise through some trees can remind a person of things like that. I guess my mind was on family, largely from all those voicemails from Joey Sr., Family Man of the Year. I pulled up my desk chair to the window and just stared a while. My phone ding buzzed. Pretty soon I might be receiving voicemails from work. I'd have to shower and get ready. Sleep, and whatever this was, had to wait. One thing I learned from the dissolution of our family unit was that the practicalities of life didn't matter. Oh, the people involved with those practicalities pretended to care. But when it came to work, if you didn't show, you got replaced. Didn't matter what was going on in your personal life, and who can blame them. It's all a machine. I showered and got dressed for work. As soon as I opened my front door, I saw them. They were past the apartment complex road and parking lots, back past the manicured magnolia and golden rain trees, up under the wilder canopy of blackjacks and pines. A man, a woman, 2 children, all holding hands. I couldn't hear them, but I could read their lips. Over and over again, rapidly, they were saying, "We're doing great, and everyone's happy." I peered, but couldn't see their faces well above their feverishly working mouths. They wore old clothing, garments that belonged in an attic or left hanging at a yard sale. I peered, but didn't dare step out onto my patio. Cars drove by in the parking lot, clueless to what lurked in the trees. I imagined someone approaching them. I imagined that family jumping out with knives, stabbing and slashing their victim while they chanted over and over, "We're doing great, and everyone's happy." I went inside, locked my door and latched the windows, and got the police on the phone. The person I spoke with became fixated on prank calls, and how there wasn't much they could do unless death threats were involved. It's like they completely ignored the part about the family outside my apartment, stalking me. So they're happy, huh? Well, that's good. I'd be more concerned if they weren't. They advised me to just block the number. Problem was, I was afraid if I blocked it, they would do more than stalking. The police didn't even send anyone out. After speaking with them, I found I had just gotten a new voicemail during the conversation. The moisture in my mouth suddenly went into my hands. I played it back. "Hey, still waiting on you. If you want to go ahead over to the address redacted, you'd meet us there. Then you'd be the one waiting. We can catch up there. Good things are on the horizon. We're doing great. And everyone's happy." That address in the message, I recognized it. I got back on my computer and pulled up my browser history to confirm. It was that company's closest location. The company that the number they were calling from was associated with. And what about the other series of digits in the very first message I had gotten? Now, as I finished typing all this up, I've got a decision to make. I'm not sure how much time is left to make it. That last message seemed especially threatening. Difficult for me to explain. Something in the emphasis, worse maybe, is that I haven't received a single voicemail since the last one. I don't know what that means. I might be okay until nightfall. Until that family is less worried, maybe, about being seen. A part of me just wants to go into work, hoping it'll make me forget about what's going on here. Maybe I can sleep there at the office instead of coming back home. I'm concerned that if I don't go to that location from their last message, they'll do something extreme. But there's something else. Sorry I haven't mentioned it yet. I was trying to get all this down. As I was trying to get it all down, I took breaks to look out the window near my front door. They're out there all right, most of the time, holding hands, mouths moving rapidly. Other times, there's this other thing. Like all that happiness had cast a great big shadow. A tall shape that moves occasionally in the trees past the parking lots. Its arms and legs work like slinkies. Its head slings back and forth like it's trying to free itself from its body. Somehow, I know it isn't very happy at all. I had always known the 1964 Ford Mustang to be my grandpa's pride and joy. He barely let anyone else touch it, let alone drive it. I think he had bought it when it was brand new. He had probably paid a fair bit for it back then, but it was probably worth a lot more new. It was still in pristine condition because of the love and care that my grandpa showed it. Most weekends, you would find him washing the car and giving it a good polish. He did most of the mechanical work himself too. I don't think he would trust anyone else to work on it. I'm not a huge car person myself, so I don't fully understand my grandpa's obsession with the vehicle, but I have seen the joy it has brought him, and I always like to see him happy. He lost a bit of his natural charm and joy when Grandma died a few years ago, but whenever I see him tinkering with the Mustang and see the smile on his face and the twinkle in his eyes, I begin to understand his passion for the car. My grandpa has always been slightly different. Don't get me wrong, he is a great man, a great father figure to me, and a usually bright and cheery fellow. I guess what makes him a bit different is how particular he is about certain things. Everything needs to be done in a certain order or a certain way, and he can get quite frustrated if you don't follow his peculiar way of doing something. I remember when I was little while visiting my grandparents, Grandpa tried to teach me that the only way to brush your teeth was by first squeezing the toothpaste into your mouth and then start brushing. Or the other time when he insisted that the only way to get rid of the hiccups was to swallow a teaspoon of honey and then jump up and down 10 times. He has plenty of other strange customs and methods too. Whether it's always locking the basement door and not allowing anyone down there because you will let the sand out, whatever that means, or the fact that he hated the song Under the Boardwalk so much so that he banned any mention of it. So, I guess that pretty much sums up my grandpa. A bit of a strange man with a bit of a strange obsession with his car. That's why I was so surprised when he actually let me drive it. It was one early morning. I had come around to visit him and try to get a few odd jobs done that he was no longer capable of doing himself. He was getting older, and I wanted to be a good grandson and help him out. When I arrived that morning, he answered the door still in his dressing gown. He invited me inside and asked if I wouldn't mind waiting for him in the kitchen. He was going to finish getting ready, but that he was probably going to be another 10 minutes or so. I made my way to the kitchen and sat down on one of the rock-hard wooden chairs that sat around the large kitchen table. Sitting in front of me was yesterday's newspaper, so I picked it up and started to read. I quickly skimmed the headline, "Farmer claims to have seen Bigfoot on Shepherd's Road." I then read an article about the disappearance of Sandy Frazier, a woman who went missing over 40 years ago, and I was halfway through reading about the hitchhiker killer when Grandpa entered the kitchen. He was now dressed in an old pair of long pants, a dull green shirt, and a woolen vest that sat over the top of the shirt. I almost immediately noticed that he had his hand held up high and grasped a set of keys. "Today's your lucky day, champ," he said to me with a grin. "You get to drive the old girl." At first, I couldn't believe what I had just heard. Had he really just said that I could drive the Mustang? Grandpa then walked closer to me and placed the keys into the palm of my hand. I felt the cold metal on my fingers, and I knew that he was serious. I was going to get to drive the car. "I need you to collect a few things for me today," Grandpa then told me. "Now, as you know, I'm getting a bit too old to be driving here, there, and everywhere, so I think you should do it. Besides, it would be best if you get a little practice driving in the Ford. You know, just in case someone leaves you one in their will." As he finished the sentence, Grandpa gave me a slight smirk, and I swear that I saw him give me a wink. I was getting the car in the will. I really couldn't believe this. I must have been staring at him in disbelief, because he then began to speak again. "Of course you didn't hear that from me," he said with a bit of a chuckle, "and of course I will need to teach you a few things about driving her before you set off today." So that's how I spent the next hour and a half learning all about the car's features and the best way to drive it. I learned how I should only adjust the mirrors whilst wearing gloves so that I didn't leave grubby fingerprints, and I learned that I should only use the windscreen wipers if it is an emergency. I also found out that the old AM radio no longer worked, and that was a good thing because listening to the radio while driving is a big distraction. I nodded and agreed to everything that Grandpa was telling me, but deep down I think we both knew I wasn't actually going to follow his advice. The last thing he said to me was I needed to visit the shops that were in town, and the best way to go to get there was down Shepherd's Road. Shepherd's Road is a small and narrow dirt road that used to be the main way into town, but once the highway was built it pretty much became obsolete. But Grandpa still swears that it is the best way to travel to town. I agreed that I would drive down Shepherd's Road instead of taking the smoother and much faster highway. After my long and not very informative lecture was over, it was time to hit the road. I hopped into the Mustang and fired her up. She roared into life, and I immediately understood Grandpa's love for the car. There was something about the way she sounded and the way that it felt while sitting in the driver's seat that made me feel powerful, a feeling I could get used to. I gave Grandpa a wave and took off slowly, trying to show him that I was taking care of his pride and joy. Once he was out of sight, however, I put my foot down and started to have a bit more fun with the car. I made my way onto the dirt path known as Shepherd's Road, and before long I was staring at the windy, dusty road. For a second, I thought about turning around and heading for the highway, but decided against it. He would know I took the highway if I returned in a sparkling, clean car and not a dusty and dirty car that would instantly need washing. So I bit the bullet and started down Shepherd's Road. It was bumpy. My God, it was bumpy. I felt every little jolt and bounce, and it felt like I was operating a jackhammer, not driving a car. I persevered, though, and continued bouncing my way down the road. I didn't see any other car or living soul. Most people were smart enough to take the highway. I continued bouncing around in my seat for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes or so when I saw her. She was walking down the center of the road. She was wearing an olden-style stripy frock. She was walking the same way I was traveling, so I couldn't see her face. All I could see was the back of the frock she was wearing and the low-heel shoes that she was wearing on her feet. She was walking slowly, seemingly minding her own business. I don't think she heard me coming up behind her, because she didn't turn around to look at me or acknowledge that I was there. I slowed the Mustang down and slowly approached the walking woman. Maybe I could give her a lift, I thought, but my mind wandered back to the newspaper I had read that morning. The words, "hitchhiker killer," entered my mind, and I thought better of stopping and letting her in the car. I was now maybe 10 meters or so away from this woman, and I began to drive out wide, trying to get the car as far away from her as possible. That's when the radio in the front of the Mustang fired up and began to play. Under the Boardwalk came blaring out of the speakers. It frightened me, and I jumped in my seat, this time because of the fear and not because of the bumpy road. I thought the radio was broken, but here it was, playing as clear and as loud as it would have when the car was new. "We'll be having some fun under the boardwalk," the radio sung. I looked down for a moment, trying to figure out how to turn the stupid thing down, but I couldn't figure it out. I looked up at the road once more. I was now almost level with the walking woman, who still didn't appear to have noticed me. I was about to steer the car outwards just a little bit more to make sure that I wouldn't hit her, when I felt the steering wheel spin in my hands. It was spinning the other way. It was steering the car straight into the woman. The car was now directly in line with the woman. I quickly tried to find the brake with my foot, but as I lifted my foot off the accelerator, I felt it push down all by itself. The car lurched forward, accelerating quickly. I heard the thud first, and then saw the woman crash into the windscreen. Small cracks appeared where she struck the glass. She then rolled back off the windscreen, onto the front of the car, then finally off the hood, and onto the ground below. I had just hit someone. I didn't mean to. The car had done it itself. I was sure of it. It was the one that swerved and sped into her. That didn't matter now, though. I was the one driving, so I was the one responsible. I sat there for a moment, unsure of what to do. I looked to the front of the car, and I could see the woman's legs poking out from the front of the car. They were unmoving. I reached for the door handle, pulled it, and got out of the car. I slowly walked to the front of the car and looked around, and saw her lying there, in a pool of her own blood. The whole front of the car was covered in blood, and my first thought was, that definitely needs cleaning. I looked down at the woman, and that's when I realized. I recognized her. I had seen her just that morning, not in person, but a photo of her. It was Sandy Fraser, the woman who had disappeared all those years ago. There was something strange about her, though. She still looked young, exactly like she did in the photo in the newspaper. She hadn't aged a day. This was very strange, and I really didn't know what to think. All I knew was that Grandpa was right. The radio was incredibly distracting while driving. If it hadn't started playing that bloody song, then none of this would have happened. I wouldn't have tried to turn it down, and I wouldn't have hit this woman. But the fact remained the same. I had hit this woman. Now the question was, what do I do with her now? I really don't know what I was thinking when I made this decision, but I decided that the best course of action was to pick up her body and place it into the trunk of the car. I walked over to the body lying in the road, bent down and scooped her up. She was a lot heavier than she looked, but with a bit of effort, I managed to lift her and walk her to the back of the car. I had to put her down again to open up the trunk, but once it was open, I lifted her once again and managed to stuff her body inside. I was closing the trunk when I saw it. I could have sworn, just as the trunk closed, I saw Sandy open one of her eyes. But that wasn't an issue for now. I could deal with that later. The trunk was already closed, and so I made my way back to the front of the car and hopped back inside. I started up the Mustang again, and it roared into life. I closed my eyes for a second, and then reopened them and found myself staring at the start of a dusty road and the street sign that read, Shepherd's Road. I was back at the start of the road. In fact, I don't think I had even begun my journey down there yet. My windscreen was still in pristine condition. There was not a crack in sight. I felt as if I had just blacked out, and everything I had just experienced was not real. Well, actually, I think it was me, but it felt like it wasn't my experience. I felt as if I now knew exactly what happened to Sandy Fraser all those years ago. I'm not sure whether or not somehow the car showed me my grandpa's experience, his memory, or whether it was something else. But all I know is that I now knew something that only me and one other person knew. Now I had to decide, do I tell someone or do I continue to hide this secret? I'm writing this down only a few hours after everything happened, now that I've calmed down a bit, and the sun is coming up and I feel somewhat safer. Last night I was laying down in bed, reading a little bit before going to sleep. I think it's important to clarify that I live on the outskirts of my town. Still in town, technically, but definitely right on the edge, just off the highway that leads out of town and into a 15-mile-long stretch of lots of country. Woods, fields, a few residences, but it's mostly open highway. So, other than the other tenants of my actual apartment building, it's normally a very quiet area. My building is a square with 4 apartments, and for each of us our door simply faces right out into the open. There's no lobby or foyer or anything. My door in particular looks out into a large field that goes up a hill. I don't remember the exact time, but sometime between 1 and 2 a.m., someone randomly started banging on my door. That would freak me out at the best of times in broad daylight, let alone in the middle of the night. Nervously, I went to ask who it was. I could hear a man with a deep voice on the other side, claiming he was a police officer, and I needed to let him in right now. That's what he said. I needed to let him in, not that I needed to open the door for him. Luckily, I watch and listen to a lot of true crime stuff, so I was very quickly suspicious of this man. I got near instant alarm bells because he could not tell me why I needed to let him in. He couldn't tell me what I'd supposedly done, and never asked what my name was either. He also clearly did not sound like a cop, if you know what I mean. Obviously, feeling creeped out, I called 911 to confirm this was actually an officer at my address, but they told me there was nobody there. At this point, I was freaking out. I called out through the door that I was on the phone with the police. I could hear the man kind of bang on my door one more time, and then immediately stop making noise, I presume because he was running off at this point. They dispatched 2 cars to my apartment, and the officers took a good look around. Unfortunately, the guy was long gone by the time they got there, and I never saw him at all, so I didn't have a description of him to give them or anything. Thankfully, the cops said 2 things to make me feel better. 1, that they'd post more patrols in my area over the Halloween weekend, and 2, it was most likely just a Halloween prank, because the bar down the street from my apartment had just had a party, and it had closed just a few moments before. I suppose the lesson is to always trust your instincts, and remember that if you have any doubts about someone claiming to be an officer, just call 911 and confirm they are who they say they are. Dispatch and the officers who came to me tonight told me you cannot get in trouble just for making sure the person you're talking to is actually an officer. This also applies to situations where it's nighttime and really dark, so you can't see for sure if it's a real cop car behind you or not. If you see flashing lights behind you on a back road or dark area at night, put on your hazard lights and call 911 first to make sure it's a real police car. You won't get in much trouble if any, and it's better to be safe than sorry. So this only happened yesterday, and it's been driving me absolutely crazy. It might not be as wild as some other stories, but it's by far one of the creepiest things that's ever happened to me. So my husband and I are walking home from having a beer at the local pub at around 6 p.m. In terms of setting the scene, we live in a small New Zealand town with a population of about 2,000. It's a real mixed bag in terms of residents. Older folk, meth heads, low income, but increasingly commuters from our capital city have all been settling down here. We fall into the latter category. It's spring here, so there was still plenty of light out, and we were chatting as we walked the 10 or so minutes home. About 3 minutes into the walk, at the first intersection, I spotted a cat sitting on the fence of one of the corner houses just on the other side of the street from us. I said meow, and it meowed back. It then started stalking a bird, so my husband and I continued watching this house, and the cat really, as we walked past. Suddenly, though, I saw a person with a brown paper bag mask over their head kind of stumble out the front door of the house into the yard. Their mannerisms and how they were moving were so strange, but I don't think they were actually like drunk or anything. It wasn't the kind of movement I'd associate with that. The house itself seemed completely dead, so there wasn't a party going on or anything like that. The person then turned and made eye contact with us. At least, the eye holes of the mask were staring at us directly. They slowly started to back away to the front door alcove of the house and disappeared from view into it. We had been slowly walking this whole time, and at this point I had literal goosebumps and an intense sense of dread. When I write it down, it might sound kind of silly, but there was something really creepy about how this person was moving and behaving. We were still looking as we walked back the house, when the paper bag face slowly emerged from the alcove, watching us before disappearing again. As we walked and got further and further away, we could see that face keep popping up in different places, appearing to look at us over and over again. Nothing, and then slowly but surely, that paper bag face would emerge to watch us once more. This continued all the way until we were at the end of the street some 350 meters away, and finally rounded the corner out of sight. It still makes my skin crawl just thinking about it. My husband laughed it off though, and said it was probably just some kid getting ready for Halloween or fucking with us. He's probably right, but I had to keep turning around to watch my back the rest of the walk home, because that shit was so creepy. So after reading a few posts on here, I've decided to add one of the creepier, still unexplained events that happened to me in a group of friends within the past 5 years. Thinking back on it even, I still get this unnerved, bad feeling that sort of lingers. Anyway, here goes. A group of friends and myself rented a place on a lake for a fun-filled, drunken weekend. We were all in our young to mid-20s, and it was supposed to be just a big party. For the most part, that's actually what it was. Friday night and Saturday morning, we went all out having a blast on the water and doing fun, stupid stuff. Naturally, when Sunday afternoon rolled around, we were all so dead from going all out, we decided it would be a night of no drinking. Perhaps only a little bit of weed smoking by some of us. Instead, we'd kind of just have a chill evening and night. Because of this, the atmosphere was very relaxed. 9 p.m. comes rolling around, and about 8 of us were inside the house. 5 were outside. The house was a 2-story with a 2nd-story deck/back porch. It was surrounded by woods. If you walked out through those woods, you would eventually hit the lake. I'll mention that we had already experienced some weird vibes from the locals when we first arrived in town. Mostly just backcountry old-timers that I assume were leering and irritated because we were college-age kids looking to have a good time. The town and the lake were so large though, so it's not like anyone knew exactly where we were staying at. Anyway, 3 of my friends were on the upstairs back porch, and my other friend and I were downstairs outside just talking on this little old table near the woods. I mean, it was otherwise just a really nice night. My friend and I were getting lost in conversation when all of a weird feeling that suddenly encompassed us. It was like an unnerving physical experience that came from the woods behind us. It was so strong we both quieted down immediately. Out of nowhere, this loud chanting abruptly started to come from the woods. I had no idea how far away it was. Because of the way the lake was set up, I'm pretty sure the voices carried up and out through the forest. It sounded like a cult chanting away, and all of the voices seemed to be male. I mean, they were very loud and perfectly in sync. We all froze for about 20 seconds. I couldn't contain myself anymore, and darted toward the house with the others following me. I don't know how to explain the feeling that came with that chanting, but it was like a tangible evil, like something so powerfully uninviting. I was shaking by the time we got up to the 2nd story, and ran out onto the balcony with the other 3 friends. One of them was my brother. By the time we got up there, the chanting had stopped. Naturally, I asked, "Did you guys hear that?" In the most shaky, freaked out voice possible. They had, in fact, all heard it, and not seconds later after asking, the chanting began once again. The 5 of us are all out there peering into the forest, listening to this strange chanting. Sometimes it would sound really far away, then it would get closer and closer until it was relatively close by. All male voices, in the weirdest language I'd ever heard. I don't even know if it was a real language, to be honest. It sounded like some strange, extreme church chanting. Suddenly, we heard a loud bang, like someone had just struck a huge metal object. Then the worst part came. A man wailing, like an extreme pain wailing. All of my hair stood up. It was the freakiest experience ever. My brother and I stared at each other in a mixture of scared excitement and horror. The wailing stopped abruptly. Then it went back to the chanting, which eventually died out altogether. I was so freaked out. I wanted to call the cops right away, because whoever screamed surely must have been in a lot of pain. That mixed with the weird chanting made me think some terrible sacrifice was going on in these woods. One of my friends tried to say it had to be some drunk guys just messing around, singing and being weird. But I know there was no way that was coming from some drunk guys. They were all perfectly in sync, and that wail of pain, it was way too real. All of a sudden it was like all that weird tension and energy just dissipated altogether. I didn't call the cops in the end. I wish I would have, but honestly the forest was so large anyway, and since the lake house was looking down at the woods and lake, it could have carried out from just about anywhere. It definitely wasn't in our close proximity, but it was close enough to be carried out by the shape of the landscape. We went in and grabbed some of the others, but by the time they came out, everything had stopped and didn't continue from then on. Someone wanted to go explore and find where it had been coming from, but obviously that was a very stupid idea, and we didn't do that. After that, I was so ready to go home. I can't explain the relief of driving away from there the next morning. Even now, just thinking about it gives me the worst feeling. Whatever that was, it felt wrong and evil. I'll never forget that moment. I can only imagine it was some weird cult stuff going on. This happened earlier this week, and it still freaks me out. I work at a hotel in my town, and was driving my husband's truck into work. He was taking mine into the shop this day to get it serviced. He has a very large truck, and I only drive it when I absolutely have to. When I pulled into the side parking lot, I noticed the entire lot was covered in snow. No one could see the lines for the spots. So of course, I began like a moron to try and park in what I hoped was an actual spot, backing up and moving forward several times. When I finally did manage to park, I got out of the truck and grabbed my backpack. All of a sudden, though, I could hear someone yelling from the sidewalk from behind the parking lot. "Hey, you need to learn how to fucking park." I was embarrassed, but just closed the truck, locked it, and began to walk to the front of the building. Now, the hotel had a side entrance for employees only. It took a code, though, and I have a really shitty memory. Usually, I would just walk around to the front and go in through the main entrance. All of a sudden, I could hear the guy yelling again. "Did you hear me, bitch?" I walked faster and took a peek behind me. I could see the man was now following me. I kept walking but called back, "Please leave me alone, sir. I need to get to work now." Before I could reach the corner of the building and make my way to the entrance, though, the man sprinted to me and gripped my arm and spun me around. I'll never forget what this guy looked like for as long as I live. He wore dark clothes with a torn-up winter coat. His eyes were extremely bloodshot, and he smelled like a combination of cigarettes and whiskey. I guessed he must have been drunk, but he didn't slur at all when speaking. "You're coming with me now." The man began to drag me back to the truck, and I tried to pull away from him. "Give me the keys, we're taking a drive." I began to scream for help, and his grip on my arm got even tighter. I'm a 26-year-old woman and not skinny at all, but I was a lot smaller than this guy. He was dragging me away so easily, and the snow on the ground just made my feet slide along. I screamed out for help, but no one was around to hear us. I kept fighting to get away from this guy. I prayed there would be any guests that could possibly hear me, but it was our slow season, so most likely there would be no one in the rooms on that side of the building. The guy turned back to glare at me. "Shut the fuck up and give me the damn keys." Now I was carrying my backpack on one shoulder. It was big and bulky from my uniform and shoes. I quickly slipped the strap down my arm, grabbed it, and swung it right into his face. The guy let go of me, and I ran for my life to the front doors. I could hear the man screaming behind me, but I ignored him. I was way too scared to look back now. I ran inside and all the way to the employee locker rooms. When I finally calmed down enough, I went to the front desk to talk to security. Sadly, there were no cameras on that side of the building, so none of this was recorded. They called the cops, and I did make a report though. The cops informed the general manager of the hotel that they needed to seriously consider security cameras on that side of the building, as drunks and druggies were known to be in this area. They got the description of the man and said they would keep an eye out for him. The manager apologized like crazy about the incident, but I told him it wasn't really his fault. He was a really good guy. I did ask security to follow me out so I could check on the truck though. Thankfully, it was fine. After that, the security guard promised to make more rounds outside, especially in the early morning, and that was about it in the end. So this happened to me a few summers ago, when I was maybe 15 years old or so. One night, it was business as usual. A few of my close girlfriends and I were getting stoned on the porch of my friend's apartment. We had pretty much been smoking and drinking all day. At 15 years old, yes, please save your life lectures for the sake of this story, I was starting to feel a little bit unwell. It was getting pretty late, so I decided I was going to hit the sack and go to sleep. At this point in the summer, I'd been spending every day at her apartment and practically lived there, so I just went and crashed on one of the couches in her room. The night goes on, and at one point my friends wake me up to let me know they were going to sneak out of the window. She lived on the first floor, and her bedroom window didn't have a screen or anything of the sort on it, so we pretty much came and went as we pleased. She said to make sure to close it behind them. I did make sure to do so. At one point though, a few minutes later, apparently one of the girls opened it back up from the outside because she had forgotten something and forgot to close it behind her. I had already fallen back asleep at this point. Now, something you should probably know about this bedroom before I go any further. The couch that I was sleeping on was about 2 to 3 feet away from the window, going directly across the middle of the room. I was sleeping on the couch, so my head was on the side that was directly closest to the window. At some point later through the night, I started to hear some rustling around outside that window. I thought nothing of it at first. Assuming it was my friends coming back from whatever adventure they'd just been on, it didn't start to worry me until I heard the rustling coming from inside this time, right next to where my head was on the couch. If it had been my friends, surely they would have been louder as they came through the window. Sleepily, I lifted my head up and muttered my friend's name, looking up at this presence. However, instead of seeing my friend's face there, I found myself staring directly into the dark eyes of a stranger. This man had a beanie hanging low on his head, covering his eyebrows, and a scarf that fully covered his mouth and nose. He had his arms through the window and had been feeling around on the floor. At this point, his body was halfway through already. His face was inches away from mine. We stared at each other for a brief moment. I'm sure I must have startled him as well, because he didn't seem to be expecting someone there on the couch. I started screaming. The man quickly drew himself out of the window and hesitated, as if he was about to run away. Instead, he reached for his belt to grab something. I started screaming even louder. I wear glasses to see and have extremely terrible eyesight, but because I had just been sleeping, I was not wearing them. To me, it looked like he was about to pull a gun from his pocket and shoot me. He pointed it at me, and I tried my best to hop off the couch and hide. I was in a panicked state, though, and my arms and legs seemed to have missed the connection to my brain. Instead of hearing a gunshot, however, I realized it was only a bottle of mace, a realization that hit me fairly quickly, when I felt it burning my face and in my eyes. Once I'd recovered from flailing around from that burning sensation, the man was long gone. I was so startled and freaked out that I could barely breathe. I called my friend, bawling, begging them to please come home, because I was all by myself. Her mother was currently out of town, and I had no idea what to do. The mace had burned my eyes badly, and I thought I was going to go blind. It hurt to even cry. I couldn't really do anything about it by myself, though, until they got back. When they finally returned, we soaked a washcloth in milk and laid it over my face to make the burning stop. We called the police as well. They came and investigated, took pictures of my face, the window, the floor, etc., before finally coming to the extremely smart conclusion that there had never been a man there at all, and I'd just been having a delusional dream. My friends all believed me at least, but the police basically brushed it off as a bullshit call and left. For weeks after, I could not sleep. I had anxiety attacks regularly, if I even so much as thought about that man's face. To this day, I have a very difficult time sleeping next to windows opened or closed, regardless of what floor they're on. I always fear seeing some dark-eyed, mace-wielding stranger doing God knows what outside. For some context, I'm a 19-year-old college student, and earlier this past year I decided to create a Grindr profile, because why the hell not? After all, I'm single, so I may as well be a dumb college student while I'm a dumb college student, right? My friends and I were studying late one night in their dorm room like always. All of my close friends lived together in the dorm, so their lounge was the primary hangout spot. It was a little bit after midnight, and I decided to go on Grindr. At this point, I'd been on the app for about 2 months and had gone on a fair amount of dates by this point. When I opened the app this time, I saw I had received a message from a guy. I don't really remember what his name was, so I'll just continue to refer to him as the guy. I clicked on his profile, and he was a pretty cute dude. He had a shirtless picture, which was common, and he was attractive enough for me to get more information on him. His caption read, "In town for work." I read his bio, and he explained that he was in town working. He was staying at a nearby hotel, and was able to host visitors there. I replied to his message, and began the typical Grindr talk. How are you? What are you into? Can you host? Etc. After talking for about a half hour or so, and exchanging pictures, we agreed to meet. I must say I didn't get any indication that this guy was a catfish, nor did I get an indication I was talking to someone who wasn't who they said they were. Usually, it would be pretty obvious when someone wasn't who they said they were. That's what I told myself at the very least. Whenever I decided to meet up with the guy, I'd always tell one of my friends, then share my location with them. I did so this time as well, and decided to head out on my way. This hotel was about 10 minutes away from my university. As I was driving there, the guy messaged me and asked, "Hey, so my business partner might be coming back soon. Would it be cool if we just did this stuff in your car?" It wasn't an unusual request to engage in CarPlay, but I did start to be a bit suspicious. Why would his business partner be arriving this late? Then again though, I was out this late, so I brushed it off and continued making my way over there. I arrived at the hotel, I would say at about 1 a.m. at this point. I looked at my phone again. I had received another message from that guy. "Hey, can you pull around to the back of the hotel?" I drove into the parking lot and made my way to the back past the pool. This is when things started to get really weird. As I pulled into the back of this hotel parking lot, I noticed a guy in a red hoodie in between some cars. I assumed it was the guy I had been messaging. I pulled into one of the spots beneath the light post, about 20 feet in front of a dumpster that sat in the corner of the parking lot. By this point, the guy in the red hoodie had gone out of my sight. Instinctively, I clicked on the button to lock my doors. I checked the app and received another message from that guy. "Yeah, pull back next to the dumpster." I assumed that since I was underneath the light, he was worried we'd be caught if a guest or hotel staff saw us or something. At this point, I was starting to get sketched out though. Maybe it was just my anxiety getting the best of me. I put my car into reverse and pulled back to the dumpster and put my car in park. At this point, I was scanning the lot for this guy, but I didn't see anyone. No sight of that guy in the red hoodie either. I felt my heart rate increase, and I began to get cold sweats. I remember thinking to myself, man, maybe I shouldn't have driven out here. I checked the app again, only to see I received another message. Okay, now turn your car off and get into the back seat. That was the point where my fight or flight response kicked in. Without thinking, I turned my car on and hauled ass out of there. I sped out of that parking lot as fast as my poor 04 car could go. I didn't even stop to check for oncoming traffic when I pulled out of the lot and onto the main road. I drove about 2 miles up the road, away from the hotel, and pulled into a Mickey D's parking lot. At this point, I was trembling. Maybe though, I just overreacted. I decided to check the app again to see if the man had messaged me anything further. You know, maybe a what the fuck, why did you leave, or something like that. But I saw the messages from that guy were gone. I assumed he blocked me, and when I checked, I couldn't find his account anywhere, so I don't really know. This leads me to believe that whatever he had planned was not good at all. Was he trying to jump me, steal my car, or maybe something even worse? Needless to say, I deleted the app after this incident. To anyone who uses any sort of dating app, be careful who you meet, where you meet, and be sure to take precautions. Our parents told us to never talk to strangers for a reason after all. When I was 12 years old, my family and I lived in an old apartment complex. I say old because it's been standing for well over 50 years by the time we moved in. Some of the residents have even claimed to have lived there their entire lives. Anyway, one particular thing that stuck out to me was that there was a strict no pets policy. The landlord actually elaborated on this, stating that a copious number of pets seemed to go missing around the area, so now they restricted them in hopes that it would end the problem there. As a child, I kept pretty much to myself. As for my brothers, who are 2 to 3 years older than me, they spoke and played with every kid that lived in the apartments and surrounding areas. Every day after school, they'd beg our mother for some change, so they could go visit the Candy Lady. She was a local resident in the apartments, who held a mini mart in her apartment. Basically, she'd buy snacks in bulk ranging from gummy snacks to chips, so she could resell it to the neighborhood kids. I'd never been at that point, but of course I was very curious. I asked my brothers if I could join them, but they declined. So I stole, $1 from my mom's purse and followed my brothers and their friends so I could find out where she lived. Upon stalking them, I finally found her apartment location. Though they stayed inside for a while, I figured I'd just go the next day. The next day after school, I took my hard-won stolen dollar and headed out to the Candy Lady's apartment. She opened the door. She was an older Caucasian lady with a very welcoming demeanor. She let me in and asked for my name. When I gave it to her, I asked for hers. She said to just call her the Candy Lady. She seemed very sweet and thoughtful, asking me about school and if I lived in the area. You know, kids don't usually come here alone. Where are your friends? She asked me. I explained I didn't really have any, and that I just preferred to observe. She seemed to sympathize with me a bit, because then she told me to take anything I wanted free of charge. As a child, I indulged in taking as much as I could carry while thanking her on my way out. She said to me, "Come back anytime, my friend." I felt pretty jolly at that point. 1, I got some free snacks, and 2, I'd made a new friend. When I got home, I hid all my snacks in my drawers, returned my mother's stolen dollar, and felt pretty great overall. That is, until I went back. I returned maybe 3 or 4 days after the first time. When I knocked, she answered the door very frantically. I kinda got scared, so I told her I could just come back later. After realizing it was me, though, she told me no worries and insisted I come in. When I did, she asked if I'd come back for some more free snacks. I gleefully told her yes, but she said the first time was just a kind gesture. From now on, though, I'd have to help her with a few things to earn my free snacks. I was used to working for things, so I agreed. It was simple enough. Just throw out the trash for her. I figured she was old and probably couldn't go outside much. The weird thing was, she had me take her garbage out to the dumpsters in the apartments next door. Fast forward to a month later. It had become our regular schedule. After school, I'd do my homework, then head over to her place to throw her garbage, as well as collect my earnings. It was all easy breezy for a while. That is, until one day, when she forgot to tie the trash bag all the way. I had walked all the way down to the dumpsters next door, but before I threw it in, I decided I'd tie it up for her first. It was loose, so I had to untie it to fix it all the way. Curious little old me couldn't help but look inside. There I saw wadded up paper towels drenched in blood and hair. It was also more black plastic bags at the bottom. This freaked me out so much, I dropped the bag right then and there and booked it home. As soon as I got there, I cried to my mother about my horrific discovery. She said she'd go out and see it for herself, after I told her which dumpster. When she returned, she said she didn't see what was inside, because the candy lady was already there, tossing it out when she arrived. My mother didn't say a word to her, and just left. She told me she didn't want me going out that far anymore, and to stop helping with other people's chores, completely neglecting what I had initially told her. Surprisingly, I was able to just forget, more like ignore what happened, and go about my kid life like nothing was wrong. Then my brothers came rushing back one day. They anxiously explained to my mom, who was as nosy as ever regarding neighbors, that the candy lady had just been taken away by the police. My mother dismissed it and told us to mind our business. My brothers were bummed out though, because of their lack of future snacks. As a child at this point in time, I really didn't understand the concept of police all that well, so I was pretty much clueless about what happened. About a month ago, I had dinner with my mom. I'm now 22 years old, by the way. My mother and I got to reminiscing, and we started talking about those old apartments. After discussing how old and broke down they were, I asked her if she remembered what I told her I saw. At first, she didn't. Then I mentioned that she was actually arrested by the police. I could see the shock of realization hit her. She said she remembered, and that she actually asked the landlord about it shortly after she was taken away. Apparently, the landlord told her that the candy lady was actually killing and skinning animals she found nearby, so she's the reason why pets weren't allowed. She was fucking killing them, and doing God knows what with the skin, and I'm the dumbass little kid who got rid of the evidence for her. For those of you wondering, the management of the apartments next to ours, the one with the dumpsters we used to dispose of the evidence, caught wind of the horrible smell reeking from them, and from there they were able to catch the candy lady. All I know is I'm glad I never went back once I realized what were in those bags of trash she had me take out multiple times. P.S. If you're the candy lady reading this, I refuse to believe you were my first friend. This happened about a year ago. I'm 16 now. He's going to be 20 in August. We met through the internet initially. It turned out he lived in a city, right next to my village. I was 12 then. He was 16. We quickly lost contact. After 2 years, I texted him again, because my friends edited a photo of him and dared me to send it. He seemed really nice, and we had lots of shared interests as well. Talking with him felt so natural. I was used to age differences, because for some reason I never meet people my age. I really didn't think too much about it. He took the bus to my village a couple of times, and we hit it off pretty well. He even met my best friend. Then I heard he'd had a Skype call with one of my online friends specifically. He told her his last girlfriend supposedly killed herself because of him, because of the horrible things he said to her. My friend felt like he was beginning to crush on her, maybe because she was too nice and kind. The other friend voiced her own worry over him turning her into his ex. She was understandably grossed out. My friends talked with him about it, and I asked why he'd told them but not me. He said it was because I was too immature to understand. I was upset. I was the person who had introduced him to my friend group to begin with, and now he was forcibly trying to cut me out of it. Thankfully, my friends had had enough of him though, and cut him out instead. I did not though. You see, I felt really bad for him. He was an orphan, he lived alone, he had issues with alcohol, and a lot of trouble with depression as well. Losing 3 people could have been so devastating in that mindset, so I kept messaging him, perhaps out of pity. He turned very, very creepy very fast. Suddenly, he began to call me darling. I was over the moon because I was a kid that had caught feelings. A little puppy crush on someone I knew I could never date, but who gave me that hope that maybe, just maybe I could. He started to spend more time with me, sent me pictures and photos of him going on about his day. Nothing too unusual. Until one time, we called while I was busy playing a game on my laptop. I don't remember what we were talking about exactly, but I remember him being so excited that 15 is the legal age in Poland. I remember feeling excited too, but I don't really know why. I remember being very, very stiff as well, even though this was just a harmless phone conversation. The joke was until February because I'd turned 15 then. That was when he was supposed to visit. I felt like I owed him everything, just because he had issues with his mental health. He told me that his psychiatrist had said she had never met someone so young who had lived through so much, even though our conversation wasn't about depression at all. He made me feel so bad for him. That's why I never said anything about the things he did that creeped me out or made me feel unsafe. I was afraid he'd feel worse and do something horrible to himself or others. He told me he'd tried to kill himself a couple times, so what if I was the reason he'd try again? He had already told me about all of his issues with loneliness and abandonment, after all. When he visited, I learned he still had feelings for this supposedly dead ex-girlfriend. He played a song that was their song, and every word in it described their relationship while we were in my room. He was close to crying, but I had no idea what to do. He'd put me in this situation, even though he knew I wasn't equipped to deal with this stuff. I remember after that I got quite upset and told him I didn't want to be cheered up. I just didn't. I wanted him to leave me alone, so he sent me tens of texts, pictures, and cheap cheer-up LOL things he found on his phone. It was the one time I set some sort of boundary, and he broke it immediately with an oops, sorry, too late message following. I had a school trip in October, and I had a pretty good time from what I remember. For some reason, I remember I just lost all my feelings for him right then and there, very suddenly. Maybe it's because, for once, I didn't force myself to feel bad for him and constantly check if he was online, wanted to talk, or if something happened. Maybe because all my friends thought we were going to date, and it was really unnerving to me that they never saw anything wrong with it. I cut contact with him very, very slowly. I started by deleting him off things he never checked. Then I blocked his number. Then I blocked him on Facebook. Finally, he noticed, but I never looked back. Later on, through yet another friend, the only one that kept in contact with him, I learned that his ex wasn't actually dead at all. Or maybe she was. There were screenshots of him talking with a family member about the funeral, then screenshots of him talking about moving in with a girl 2 years older than he was, who was the love of his life, same name as his ex and everything. He then sent a picture that was supposed to prove he was in a psych ward or something, but then even my friend refused to believe him. I can't really tell what he was lying about in the end, or even if he was lying at all. Next school year, I'll be going to a school in the city he lives in, and I know he's still there, so I really hope we don't meet. I was reminded of him just last week. After almost 5 years of not hearing from him, I saw him again. I'll try my best to summarize this nightmare. Some things to note which are important to the story. 1. It happened in 2017, and during that time we went a whole year without having neighbors on either side, so basically we were crammed in between 2 empty houses. 2. The street light in our lot had broken, and despite multiple reports to the council to fix it, nobody ever did. One evening my family went out for groceries. I was left behind home alone. The gate was still wide open when they left because the water pipe was located outside. I used it all the time back then because I had rabbits, so I used that water to fill their water bowls. That day was no different. The sun was already setting by the time I went out to fill the bowls, feed the rabbits, and then lock the gate. It was literally 5 minutes after I locked it that someone was outside. Since the sun was already low on the horizon, and with the street light broken, I could barely make out his face. The man was outside with a van, yelling for my attention. He said something about his company sending him over to do some property surveillance. It was suspicious, alright, so I ignored him and went inside. Later on, when the night got dark, my family still had not returned yet. I was inside watching Chicken Little when I suddenly heard some commotion outside. I didn't directly look at it, but I stole some glances. I could make out a figure outside, literally in front of my gate. He was shouting for my attention once again, and guess who it was? Yep, the same guy from before. I recognized his voice again. I paid him no attention. After a seemingly long few minutes, it got quiet outside. I took another peek out only to see, holy shit, he was attempting to climb into my house. I was so shocked I couldn't move. Luckily, that time we had a dog named Buck who passed away not long after, unfortunately. He was probably napping in one of his hiding spots and sensed the man's presence. As soon as the guy saw Buck coming at him, he stopped climbing and rode away on his bike, no more van. And that was that. Ever since then, though, I kept seeing him around. How do I know it was him when I couldn't even see the face in the first place? Well, because after that particular incident, every now and then, there was always this person hanging literally outside our gate with his bike. He was always making this weird sound too, like when you purse and smack your lips. Every time I tried to report it to my dad, the guy would just ride away as soon as he saw my dad checking. One time, I was at the backyard collecting my laundry. If you stand on the left side of my gate, but facing in, You can see the area in our backyard where we wash and dry out the clothes. I saw him standing right there, making those weird sounds again, which drew my attention. I yelled out for my dad, and once again, he saw my dad and booked it immediately out of there. This had been going on now for almost a month. While he hadn't actually posed a physical threat, it was enough for me to feel uncomfortable and unsafe to even want to go out at night by myself. But it got worse. My room is on the outer side of the house, so basically, I have a window that faces the front. My room is situated on the right side, so my direct view is the overgrown bushes covering the fence. If I peek my head out that window and look to the right, I can clearly see the gate. One night, I was in my room doing some work on my desk, I think. The window was to my left. I'd left it open, as I always liked the night breeze coming in. I don't remember exactly how long I was working for, but all of a sudden, I felt a strong feeling of dread washing over me. It was like I wasn't safe in the comfort of my own room anymore, like I was being watched. I looked out the window and tried to see in the dark. I could barely make it out, but there he was. I knew it was him. Somehow, he'd managed to squeeze in between the bushes and was hanging on to the fence. He saw me, and I could feel a smile come over his face. He made those awful lip-smacking sounds again. I booked it the fuck out of there like a bolt of lightning. Again, I reported it to my dad, but again, he'd somehow made it out of there before we could catch him in the act. Because of his amazing disappearing act, my dad and sister sometimes thought that some of the incidents were just imagined. Whenever they turned their eyes outside, they would see nothing, but I was the one who saw him every time. I know for a fact that it was real, though, that he was real, and it was the same person every time. This continued on for another month or so 2 months in total. He'd come and taunt me with his lip-smacking skill, and rode away before my dad or sister could ever get a good look at him. Then one day, he just stopped coming. I didn't see or hear his stupid, lip-smacking sounds anymore. That is, until last week. I was home alone again. My sister was caught up at work, and my dad had left to pick up my brother from his workplace. I was sitting in the living room watching the TV, when I heard that awfully familiar lip-smacking sound. At this point, our street light was still broken. We'd installed some fence lights, though. Somehow, though, this guy figured it out, and hid in the dark where the light was too faint to reach. I could see he was out there with his bike again, only this time I heard him giggle. I had never heard him giggle before, and this wasn't the cute kind. It sounded malicious. I tried my hardest to ignore him, to not pay any attention, but he was out there making all sorts of noises. Over a year ago, we got a new dog, Gibbs. He was a rescued stray. He must have heard the man, too. As soon as the guy saw Gibbs start chasing after him, he rode away again. That was last week. 5 years ago, he terrified me to the point where I was so afraid of being outside on my own at night, even if it were just to pick up laundry. Sometimes at night, I couldn't even sleep without checking every corner of the house just to make sure he was not there, and for a short period, I even slept with the lights on. Even though he didn't exactly do anything physically threatening, him playing psycho tricks over such a long period on me is enough to make me feel unsafe in my own home. Just when the man was finally exiting my head, he came back at the perfect time. Worse still, I don't think I've ever seen his face, but I think he has seen mine. I hope I won't ever have to see his face, because his presence alone is malicious as it is. So to give some context, I'm a small-statured girl, about 5 feet 1 inch. I guess that makes me look easily preyed on, I don't know. One night, at around 9:30 p.m., I realized I had no more pads and needed to go get some. Walgreens closed at 10, but it wasn't that far away, so I decided to head there right away. The Walgreens I headed to wasn't exactly in the best area. It was one of those neighborhoods that wasn't too safe, but was surrounded by other safe neighborhoods, so it wasn't exactly the worst, either. I parked my car directly behind the door, so I could see it from the entrance. There were spots in front of me that were closer to the door, but they were there in complete darkness. I would rather have to walk a little further from a well-lit spot than be hidden in the darkness. I was the only car in the parking lot, too. I was on FaceTime with a friend, and I started walking toward the doors. I realized my car may still have been on. It's a push start, so sometimes I forget if I turned it off or not, but I always lock it regardless. I turned around to go check if it was still on. As I locked my car door and started walking away, a car came pulling in super quick. I immediately felt uneasy. I'm really paranoid by nature, so I just hurried up and walked inside. As I went inside, my friend had to leave from the FaceTime. I made my way to the aisle and couldn't seem to find the pads at all. I was in the adult diaper area trying to find some. I suddenly had that feeling that someone was following me, as I heard footsteps and just felt weird. There was only me and the employee in the store, though. Maybe they thought I was stealing, as it was about to close. This kind of pissed me off, but whatever. Do your job. I kept looking for the pads, and as I turned a corner, I noticed that whoever was following me kept ducking off into random aisles. As I turned to the next one, though, the person wasn't quite fast enough, and I caught a glimpse of them. It was not an employee. It was a 5 feet 4 inches or 5 feet 5 inches older man, maybe late 40s or early 50s. He had frosted tips and looked like he was trying to look younger, but looked like a sketchy man instead. I felt weird, but I thought my paranoia was overthinking me. I grabbed my pads and went to the register. I kid you not when I tell you this man ran to the register empty-handed. If you would have been in the store as long as me, 15 minutes, and still had nothing on you, that was weird. He grabbed some sodas from the register fridge. I checked out and walked to the side of the store by the coolers in the photo area. This way I could see the register and the door, but they couldn't see me. I called my boyfriend and told him what had happened, and to come immediately. The man took forever to check out his 2 soda bottles. Then he exited. I told the employee what's going on. She looks outside only to see that he's parked on the driver's side of my car. He drove a black older van model, think 2000 Pacifica or something like that. She said he had been acting weird and antsy too, and when I walked away he immediately asked where I'd gone. Thankfully she let me stay there until he left, which took 7 minutes. My boyfriend arrived shortly after. I told him the description of the car, and he told me that as he pulled into the lot, he'd seen that car circling the building a few times, then hiding in the darkness of the back parking lot. Yikes. I haven't returned to that location ever since. This story didn't happen to me, but to a very close male friend of 7 years. I was hanging out with him and a couple of other friends, and we were talking about all of our creepy experiences. Here is the story from his perspective. A little bit of background. I was 16 years old when this happened, living in Amman City, the capital of Jordan in the Middle East. I was in high school at the time. I used to weigh 85 kilograms and was 192 centimeters tall. I was a calm but somewhat intimidating person, at least if I wanted to be. I never really messed with anyone though, unless I was provoked first. I had just gotten off school this day and decided I wanted to go downtown because I was bored. I really didn't want to stay at home. Actually, I wanted to get some DVDs and games to enjoy later, so I decided to take the bus, as I wanted to save on some money. I had to take a taxi to even get to the bus stop though, which was about less than 10 minutes by car. I stopped a coming taxi. Inside the vehicle appeared a light-skinned man with black greasy hair, wearing a worn-out dark green shirt and an old pair of jeans. He looked to be between the ages of 30 to 34. He addressed me through the passenger window. "Hey there, where do you want to go?" "I need to go to the bus stop that takes me downtown. It's about 10 minutes away from here." "Oh well, I can take you downtown if you'd like. I'm gonna pass by that area anyway, so I can drop you off there and you don't even have to pay me." At this point, a red flag should have gone off in my head, but I thought maybe this man just wanted to be kind. I really didn't want to go through the hassle of taking more than one vehicle, so I decided to hop into his car, and we would be on our merry way. Looking back on it now though, this was a big fucking mistake. Now there are different ways to head downtown, and I only knew a couple of them. As the man was driving, he started to take different routes that I had never seen before. Since I wasn't familiar with them, no alarm bells were ringing yet. I assumed he must be taking a shortcut to get away from traffic or something. By this point though, 20 minutes had passed by, and I began to feel very uneasy. Usually from the bus route I take, you only need 20 minutes to get downtown when there's little to no traffic, but I brushed it off once again. Then suddenly though, the man began to speak in his calm yet very suspicious tone. "Hey man, do you mind if I use your phone for a moment? I want to see if you have any videos or music I can send via Bluetooth." I found this to be a very strange request, but as the man was giving me a free ride already, and the fact that I didn't have anything private in my phone anyway, I handed it over to him for a moment. I didn't want to be impolite. I was just trying to break this awkward atmosphere. He started to play with my phone for a bit, before proceeding to put it with his own under the empty space of driver's door handle. Doubt began to circle in my mind. I felt very vulnerable suddenly without my phone. Despite my doubts though, all I could think to do was stare to the window outside. The feeling of dread and uneasiness only continued to grow. I was not able to tell where we were anymore. The man kept on driving. I started to see many empty roads, with only desert on both the right and left sides. The only things around were various old worn-out rusty shipping containers. It was getting very dark at this point. This is where things get even creepier. The man proceeded to pick up his own phone and began to speak to someone at the end of the line, shouting in a very angry voice. "I'm gonna fuck you up, you motherfucker. You better prepare yourself. I'm coming to beat your ass, you son of a bitch." As soon as the man ended the call, I knew something was absolutely wrong. Looking more closely at the phone he was holding, I was able to recognize the phone he had was the type that didn't have Bluetooth. Alarm bells started ringing very loudly in my head. That whole call had just come out of nowhere, and I could feel a bunch of dread. My fear was absolutely real. I asked him for my phone back, growing very nervous and impatient with each word escaping my mouth. He looked at me with this kind of funny look and said, "I just wanted to see what you've got on your phone, you know." By this point I had enough. I sternly told him to give it back. The anger and fear was barely contained in my voice. He hesitantly obliged after muttering to himself for a while. I knew at this point I had to get out of this taxi. Feeling a rush of adrenaline, I decided to pretend I was talking to my parents and created a scenario where there was an emergency and I had to get back right now. I began telling the man that someone was waiting for me and needed me immediately. I told him to drop me off right here and right now. I was seeing an upcoming traffic light and then nothing from then on. I knew this was my only chance of escape. I was not sticking around any longer to know where this man was taking me to. God fucking knows where we even were already. As soon as the man stopped at the light, I spoke to him in my most intimidating voice and told him to open the passenger door. Luckily, there were also a couple of cars stopped right next to us. Thank God the man just responded with a menacing look and pressed the unlock button. I sprinted out of that car faster than you could even say "fuck this shit, I'm out." I went straight to a small run-out coffee break stop in the middle of nowhere as that taxi sped off at 100 miles per hour. I went outside and asked the server if downtown was close by. Completely out of breath and with sweat dripping from my forehead, the server looked at me with a confused, irritated face. "You know you're far out of the capital, right? Heading to the city of Zarka?" Shit, I thought. Holy shit. I proceeded to call my parents to come pick me up from this middle of nowhere. God knows I'm not taking the taxi to get back home after this, or anytime soon. Thinking about it after a while, it's clear the man had planned on kidnapping me from the start, trying to take away my phone so I wouldn't be able to call for help, and proceeding to pretend he was having a fight with someone on the phone to secretly message his buddies that he was close by with me. Hey there everyone, I wanted to tell you about an experience my brother and I shared 2 years ago. I'd made a post over in our /paranormal, but I decided to repost it here too. So, we were deciding to go somewhere haunted during the day. There's this old cemetery in Santa Cruz we decided to check out. We go in, walk around, nothing out of the ordinary happens, so we decided to leave. The cemetery is on a supposedly haunted road that leads up into the woods. This road is said to be haunted by a lady in white that tries to hitchhike in your car. I had forgotten this fact until after the day. Alright, so along this road we're driving down, it leads to a forest area. A couple of miles down from the cemetery, you can pull to the side of the road and walk along this hiking trail. We decide to hike this very same trail. I'd completely forgotten the road was supposed to be haunted as well, so I wasn't even looking for anything paranormal at all. Anyway, we start hiking this trail in the afternoon. 10 minutes in, we stumble along some abandoned train tracks and a barely standing bridge for the train that used to run along those tracks. It looked really cool, so we decided to head down to investigate this hill right by the bridge that lets you go underneath the dilapidated area. We go down and start to mess around, looking at all the cool architecture. After we had our view, we started back up the little hill that led back to the trail. When we finally managed to get to the top, we were a little bit exhausted because the hill was kind of steep. You also had to use the trees around you as leverage to climb back up. We're standing around back on the trail when we both notice something out of the ordinary. We can both hear a voice, almost like a grown man's, shouting and screaming very angrily. When I say angry, I mean absolutely furious. The voice sounded like the rage of a man that wanted to murder someone. We quieted down. We could tell the voice was still very far away. It almost sounded like it was coming from the mountains around us, more than 500 feet away for sure. We both looked at each other. What the fuck is that? We stood around listening for 15 seconds. Next thing we know, the voice had suddenly come down the trail from what sounded like hundreds of feet away to being right down at the very end of it. The inhuman speed with which the voice came closer seemed so unnatural. I noticed it was now coming down the trail as well. I was thinking to myself this voice sounded like it was from someone who was ready to kill, but the weird thing was, the voice was speaking, and what I could only say was gibberish. I could not understand one single word it was saying. I instantly got this fight or flight feeling all in my body as the voice started getting very loud and moving closer to us at completely inhuman speeds. I told my brother to pick up some huge sticks with me to defend ourselves. Even though this voice had come out of nowhere and was moving down the trail at lightning speed, I still had the assumption it must be some kind of crazy person out in the mountains having an episode or something. We picked up those sticks and sprinted down the trail back to the car. Now here's the weird part. As we're running away from this voice that's coming down the other end, I suddenly hear the voice come up right behind us in a single instant. It sounded like he must be no more than 10 feet away, chasing us back to the car. I turned around, even though I didn't want to see. I just had to know how close this psycho was to us. As I looked back though and heard the voice right behind me, I could see no one there. I told my brother to run faster because the voice right behind us was yelling in absolute rage, but I couldn't see anyone behind us. We started picking up speed, and the craziest thing in my entire life happened. The voice panned around us, almost like 360-degree audio. I could hear the voice yelling gibberish right into my ear. Then it started panning to my left through the trees just off the trail. Then it was right in front of us. Then it slid to the right, and then back behind us, all in just a matter of seconds. At this point my brother and I were obviously very creeped out, and ran the rest of the way back to the car. The voice followed us all the way back. I remember hearing it panning around us, reverberating all through the woods, and I started praying to Jesus Christ to help me come out of this alive. After we made it around halfway down the trail to my car, the voice just suddenly disappeared. I remember slowing down, completely exhausted, and we started talking about what we'd just heard. I asked my brother if he'd also heard it panning around us in circles, and he said he'd heard the same thing. At that point I knew I was not hallucinating or imagining things. I asked my brother if he'd heard it as gibberish as well. He said he'd heard the same thing. We finally got into the car and drove the hell out of there in a heartbeat. I remember the car ride was silent for about 5 minutes as we sat there thinking about what just happened. That's when I remembered the whole road was supposed to be haunted, not just the cemetery. I had been down that very same trail alone a few months before this experience, and nothing weird happened to me then. This was one of the most unexplainable things I ever experienced in my entire life. To this day I've never been back down that trail, and I never plan on going back either. Everything I've written down is the absolute truth. I haven't altered a single thing. The Santa Cruz area and mountains are known for cults and dark magic being performed in them, I guess. I had visited my family for the holidays and was driving back home. The trip in total was about 10 hours, which I split into 2 drives on the way up. But on the way back, I decided to power through it in one long drive. Around the halfway point, snow started coming down. It wasn't too much, so I wasn't worried about it. However, it got worse as I kept driving. Once I was 3 hours away from home, it was pouring down pretty heavily, and with the sun going down as well, it definitely was not ideal. There were almost no other cars out though, which is the only reason I decided to keep driving. The snow made it harder, but I was still on track to be home by the end of the night. It was just after the sun had fully set, and about 30 minutes out from the nearest town I'd passed through, that I noticed a car on the road ahead of me. Their headlights were the only light on the road in the middle of the blanket of snow covering everything else, and as I got closer, it was clear that they were stuck, or at least not moving. Their car was sideways on the road, with their hazard lights flickering, and a man was standing out in the cold next to it. Obviously, with the snow and cold, I really didn't want to stop, but it seemed I didn't have a choice. His car was blocking most of the road off that was paved. I parked just behind him. The man immediately started waving at me and walked up to my window. My car slid and got stuck there. "Can you help me push it out?" He spoke slowly, like his English wasn't the best, but hoping I could get back on the road as soon as possible, I agreed to help him. The car didn't really look like it was in too much snow, so maybe just a little push might actually be enough. I threw my hat and gloves on, then got out. The wind hitting my face and snow instantly soaking me made me wonder why the guy even got out of his car and didn't just call for help. My face and hands were already getting numb, so I hurried to the back of his car and waited for him to get his gloves. It was too dark to see anything through the windows, and after a little bit of standing back there waiting, I looked around to see what was taking him so long. He was still leaning into the front seat, as if looking for his gloves, but I thought I heard him talking. A second later, he came back out and looked at me. Were you talking to me? I asked. He looked concerned, but said he was just talking to himself. He smiled, then walked around to the back to help me push. I couldn't help but feel like something had changed, though. His whole demeanor and the situation just felt different. Although I didn't hear what he said, it didn't really sound like he was talking to himself. But if someone else was in the car, then why was he out here alone and asking for my help? All these thoughts came rushing through my head, and I guess for a few seconds, I was kind of spaced out. So much so that I didn't notice the man staring at me. His smile had dropped, and he had an eerie look in his eyes, like they were hollow and lifeless, completely opposite of what he looked like before. I didn't even hesitate, beginning to hurry back to my car. Just then, several doors from the car I was just behind opened, and 3 more men got out, rushing toward me. I sprinted into my driver's seat, and thank goodness I left my car on, because I put it straight in drive and rolled past them, almost hitting one on the way out. I was terrified of possibly getting stuck in the snow bank, as the path around their car was very thin, but thankfully I made it around, and was able to get away. I put in a report with the police at the closest town, but there were never any updates, as far as I know. I'm assuming the men weren't really stuck, and probably left right after I did. I don't know what those men were up to. Of course I had my guesses, but if I had stayed, and didn't leave right when I did, who knows where I'd be. This was last year. It was late November, and this was the first snowfall of the season. It wasn't supposed to be anything too much, just a couple inches of snow. I got home from work around 8, and by then the snow had already started. I heated up some leftover pizza, and stayed downstairs for a couple hours. Around 10, I went upstairs to my bedroom, sitting at my desk with my laptop. Before I could even open up something to watch, I heard something right above me. It sounded like a thud in the ceiling. I thought it was likely the snow, weighing down on the roof, and was probably nothing to be concerned about. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't concerned at all, though. This was my first winter at this house, and it wasn't in the best shape, so part of me was a little worried about any possible leaks or other problems. I tried to not think about it too much, and continued looking for something to watch. But then it happened again. A thud, resonating through the ceiling. I looked up, and the thuds continued, sounding almost in a straight line across the ceiling. I was genuinely worried now. I got up and grabbed my winter jacket, then hurried out the front door and looked up at the roof. Unexpectedly, the side of the roof that my bedroom was under, there was no snow on it, and it all slid off and fell into a pile in front of the house. I looked at the other side of the roof, and the snow was still there. I then looked at my neighbors' homes, and all of them still had snow sitting on their roofs, like normal. The way the snow had fallen off just one side of my roof didn't seem natural. Like something was either wrong with my roof, or something else had made this happen. Probably whatever those thuds were that I was hearing. With no more answers to find outside, and my whole body starting to shiver from the cold, I walked back to the front door. I opened it, and hurried inside, stomping my boots on the doormat. When I looked up, though, my heart almost stopped. There were puddles of water going across the hallway. I stayed still and looked around, seeing water going through the living room, and even up the stairs next to me. It only took me a second to see a boot print in one of the puddles, and I immediately turned right back around and headed out the door. I stood by the road and called the police, shivering as I tried to tell them my situation. About 30 seconds into the call, I saw something move past one of the windows in my bedroom, and moments later, a figure stood behind the glass, looking down at me. They only stayed for a second, then backed away. I didn't see anything else the rest of the time that I waited for the police. As I was waiting, though, I put together most of the pieces in my mind. Someone had made it up on the roof, making the snow fall as they walked across. There were several windows they could have gotten in from, that I honestly had no idea if they were locked or not. When police arrived, they didn't find the intruder inside anymore, but they basically confirmed my theory. There were multiple trees going over top my house that anyone could easily climb, and with the windows being accessible, it made for an easy target. At least, the officers think that's the reason they broke in, just because I was an easy target. Nothing was missing, though, and the way the shoe prints went through the whole house felt eerily like them looking for me. What's crazy is that I must have gone outside to check on the roof at the exact time they got in through the window. If I was any later, I would have been face to face with them, or if I'd gone back inside sooner, they might have not left tracks through the house yet, for me to immediately notice. It's been nearly an entire year since this, and so far, nothing else has happened. Maybe it was just a one-time attempt, but I don't think I'll ever feel safe with all the uncertainties of what happened that night. It was mid-December. I was only 17 at the time, and every year just before Christmas week, my mom had to go on a 3-day business trip for work. Being an only child that lived just with my mom, I'd spend these days that she was gone home alone. Usually she'd leave just before winter break, so I'd be in school for most of the day. But this year, she left the same day that our school let out for the holidays. I had the house to myself and wanted nothing more than to stay inside and chill all day. Our city was going through somewhat of a snowstorm, so I couldn't leave the house anyway. I made some of the food that was left for me and found a new movie to watch. I had to pause it several times throughout the couple hours though, because the wind and snow would suddenly pick up and get really loud. It seemed like every time I looked outside, the weather was worse. Then around 7 or 8, someone was walking up to the front door. I could hear their footsteps kicking against the snow, and they coughed several times as they slowly made their way up to the porch. I didn't have a clue who it could be. I paused everything and looked at the door, waiting for them to knock or ring the doorbell. As more time passed though, I could feel myself getting nervous as something didn't feel right. I want to say I waited 3 or 4 minutes, not hearing anything, before I went up to the door and looked outside. Nobody was there. I could see the footsteps coming right up to the door, then going back the way they came. I was really confused how clearly I heard them walk up, but somehow I didn't hear them leave. Also, with the snowstorm outside, what reason could someone have to come up to my house? I think the only reason I could settle on was that the snow made it difficult to see, and they mistook my house for theirs. Maybe they realized once they got up to the porch and didn't want to alarm anyone, so they quietly left. It's probably a bit of a stretch, but I guess it was possible. After a while, I'd mostly stopped thinking about the situation and was more caught up worrying about the storm. The power cut out a few times, lasting for several minutes before it came back on. Because of that, I couldn't really watch TV or anything, so I just sat on the couch and scrolled on my phone. It was maybe around 11, when through the harsh wind, I heard a thump against the house. I initially ignored it, but only a few moments later, the power cut out again, thinking the thump might have caused it. I got up. It sounded like it was from the side near the kitchen, so I turned my phone light on, then walked over and looked around. I thought it was probably just a coincidence that the power shut off right after I heard the thump, but I just wanted to be sure nothing happened. I didn't see anything, and I started to walk away. Hey! I jumped and looked at the back door, seeing a man standing against the other side. The back porch light wasn't on, so he was mostly covered by the dark. I could only see his face, peering in at me. "Hey kid, would you get the door for me? It's freezing out here," he said, putting his hand on the door and trying to open it. My head wasn't fully grasping the situation yet, and I kind of just stood there and stared at him. "Kid, get the door, please." Something gave me a bad feeling. I knew better than to trust this guy, even though it was a blizzard outside. The man started coughing, and I started to back up, and the man's face instantly fell into a disturbing frown. "Open the fucking door," he yelled, banging his fist against it several times. I ran back to the couch and got my phone. I then stood in the hallway and watched the man as I dialed 911. My phone was struggling to hold service and kept dropping the call, but after a few tries, I was able to get through long enough to ask for help. The man at the door continued to yell at me and hit the door, but eventually ran off. I'm assuming the snowstorm caused some trouble for the police, as they didn't make it until nearly 30 minutes after. I told them what I could, and I called my mom to let her know what happened. Nobody really knew what to think of it. He could have been stalking me and trying to guilt me into letting him in, or he could have actually been in need of help, although it's unlikely. I never saw him again after that night though. I work at a gas station. I'd been there for several years, and this night was one that I assumed would be like all the rest. I came in at 8 and took over for the day worker, who went home right away. The first couple hours went by quickly, as there were still customers coming in regularly to buy a few things or to pay for gas with cash. Between 11 and 12, it slowed down to where it began feeling like the shift was dragging on. I kept myself busy for another hour, or at least tried to, with stalking whatever I could find, but then I was left with the dreaded second half of my shift. It was always slow, boring, and just not enjoyable. Around 1 though, a car pulled in and parked in the spaces by the entrance door. A few other cars had come through recently, but just to get gas real quick. Very rarely would someone actually park in the spots and come into the store this late into the night. I stood up straight and tried to rub the tired look off my face, expecting them to come in. A couple minutes went by though, and they didn't. I leaned over the counter and looked out the glass door, but couldn't really see anything. The reflections on the door were blocking any way for me to see inside their car. Maybe they were just taking a break from a long drive. I didn't bother caring too much about it. I sat back and pulled up my phone. I spaced out, reading through random articles and whatnot for probably 20 or so minutes. During that time, I never heard anything or saw anything, but eventually I looked up from my phone, and my heart almost stopped. There was a guy inside the store, standing in one of the aisles and looking right at me. His eyes darted away as soon as I saw him. This guy looked like he was mid-40s, with a dark jacket on and a scruffy beard. I never saw or heard him enter, so how the hell did he get in? While my mind was racing, I just watched as the man kept walking around, glancing over at me a few times to see if I was looking, like he was planning to do something as soon as I looked away. Then after just 30 seconds, he suddenly hurried toward the front door and ran outside. I got up and ran to look out. This was when I noticed the car was still there, but the guy walked right past it and just out to the road until I could no longer see him. I immediately went to the cameras to see how he got in and figure out what was going on. It only took me a minute to find footage of him slowly and quietly getting out of the car, then going to the back of the gas station. There were no cameras back there, but those doors were never locked since the gas station was technically always open anyway. What's really odd is that there were 15 minutes between the time he went around to the back to the time he walked out onto the sales floor. Police came to help me investigate, ultimately finding the car he left to have been a stolen vehicle from months ago. They didn't know anything about the guy or his motives. Sneaking around though, he clearly had something else intended for that night, and I think I was really lucky that for one reason or another, he decided not to go through with it. I was on a week-long hunting trip, and I was staying in my uncle's cabin in the dead middle of winter. It was a long day, and I was about to head back to the cabin shortly. It had been snowing lightly on and off all day, but out of nowhere the snow picked up very quickly and turned into a very dense snowstorm. It was getting late, and I had a long way to walk back to the cabin, and I was honestly terrified because it felt like every minute that passed by the storm was getting worse and worse. It was almost a miracle that I saw a light up ahead. It was a really bright light, but it shines dimly from where I could see, just enough for me to notice it. As I got closer, I soon realized it was another cabin. My adrenaline instantly sparked, and I was happy to have found a potential shelter. I would have had to walk miles upon miles in that blizzard to get back to my uncle's cabin, and I would have been screwed. I thought for sure I would have found myself lost in the blizzard searching for my cabin, had I taken that route instead. Knowing what I know now though, and with what happened to me, I wish I would have just manned the fuck up and found my way back to my cabin. But I could barely even see what was in front of me, and ultimately, that played a huge part in the final decision of me trying to get in contact with whoever was inside. I was just hoping my luck wouldn't have run out completely. What was the chance this guy was actually going to be a serial killer or something like that? I convinced myself that shelter was worth the risk. I approached the cabin, and I knocked on the door. I heard footsteps that seemed like they were getting closer to me. I waited another 30 seconds, maybe, and politely knocked once again. The man opened the door, and I explained to him my situation. He let me in with open arms and let me stay for the night, surprisingly. I told him I would be gone first thing in the morning. This guy kind of gave me the creeps, but being totally serious here, I wasn't that worried about it. People out here were known for being that way. Not necessarily creepy, but I could sense he wasn't the extroverted type. Let me just put it that way. He barely spoke to me at all. He gave me a pillow and told me I could sleep on his couch in the main room. I tried making small talk with him, but that didn't go very well. I didn't want to bother him, so I thanked him once again for letting me stay, and I told him I was going to try and get some rest. I lied my head down on the pillow, and I was getting ready to relax. The man was now standing behind me, so he was completely out of my sight. I was waiting for him to walk away, but he stood there for a good 30 seconds or so, and he didn't make a sound. I thought that was kind of weird, but still, I didn't think much of it. Then he turned the light off over the sink, which was the only light that was still on in the cabin at the time. I figured that meant he was finally going to lay down as well, but I was wrong. He walked away towards his room, and I started to doze off within minutes. What the fuck was that? I sat up so quick that I almost threw myself off of the couch. I looked back and all around me, but it was pitch black. I couldn't see a thing. Everything all right back there? I asked, but there was no reply, to which I then stated, all right, good night then. I was genuinely starting to get anxious, and I started to rethink my decision of staying there. I convinced myself that it was nothing though, and that I should just try to fall back asleep. I finally fell asleep maybe 15 to 20 minutes after that, and I have no idea how long I was out for, when all of a sudden, I awoke to the guy on top of me. At first, he was literally only just laying on me long ways. His body was stiff as ever. I awoke within seconds, and I tried to get him off me. He was much stronger than me though. He then started choking me and smelling me like smelling my hair and touching my face. He even tried to kiss me. I managed to headbutt him, which in turn gave me just enough time to gain the upper hand and throw him off of me. I ran for the door immediately, and I forgot. Shit! Just as I was about to leave, I realized I couldn't leave without my gun. I turned back around to grab it, and there he was pointing my own rifle at me. I was close enough to him and fast enough that I managed to duck and weave and disarm the man. He was a bit older, and that gave me the confidence to do what I had done. I hit him with the butt of my rifle, and I ran out the door. It was still snowing out really bad, but I could tell that it lightened up just a bit. It was a long night, and it took me hours to find my cabin as I had to walk at least 2 miles. That's if I took a linear path to the cabin. I was walking around aimlessly for quite some time, just winging it in 7 to 8 inches of snow in the middle of the night with a snowstorm clouding my vision on top of that. I later found out from the police that the person who owned that cabin had mysteriously disappeared years ago, and no one has owned it since. That legit gave me shivers when the officer told me that. That guy was going to kill me. Scariest thing about it is, I don't think they caught the guy yet either. 2 winters ago, my dad got me a car for my birthday. Not only was it new, but it was also my first car. I had just gotten my license a month prior, and my father felt that I earned it. I was really excited, but the only problem was that we had just got hit with a really bad snowstorm, literally the same day, the day of my birthday. So obviously, that meant I wasn't going to be able to do any driving anytime soon, until the snow at least cleared up a bit anyways. I was really bummed out about the snowstorm, but I was thankful for the car. Skip ahead to that same night, I was sitting in my room, and I was pondering the decision of taking my new car for a spin. I almost convinced myself to do it, but I knew my dad would kill me if he found out that I snuck out and drove without his permission, and especially with how shitty the roads were. The roads were absolutely horrible, and I knew it was a bad idea, so I decided against it. Fast forward to the next night, I had been telling all my friends about my car, and how excited I was. My friend Eric ended up asking me if I wanted to hang out that night, but I told him I couldn't. He later stated that he really wanted to get out of the house because I guess his dad was being shitty again or something. I don't want to get into this part too much, but basically from what I understand, Eric's dad is a horrible person that has been physically abusing him for years now. Eric said his dad had another drunken outburst and practically begged me to pick him up, so I did. After all, I wasn't going to leave my friend there all alone and not do something about it. I made my way out to the car, and I had to sneak out my bedroom window. As I was driving down the road, along the way, I noticed an old man in the middle of the road. I could barely see him because it was snowing quite heavily, and I didn't have enough time to stop because the roads were so icy. But I had no choice other than to slam on my brakes in a panic, because I was about to hit the man. The wheels lost all traction, and I very quickly started to spin out. Before I knew it, I was swerving onto the other side of the road, and I crashed into a ditch. I started panicking, not sure what to do. All I could think about was how fucked I was, and that once my dad found out, he was going to literally murder me. The man from earlier that was in the road made his way over to me, to my driver's side door, and asked me if I was okay. I told him that I was fine, and that I wasn't hurt at all. I got the creeps from this man right off the bat, and I really wanted him to get the hell away from me, honestly. I politely as possible told him to leave me alone, and that I had to go. He got the hint, and he stepped away from my car. I wasn't even paying much attention to where he went. All I know is that he continued walking the way he was going when I first saw him, which was the opposite direction that I was going. I reached for my phone so I could call my dad to pick me up, but that was when I realized my phone wasn't in my pocket. I began looking all over for it, and I searched my car everywhere. I knew I didn't forget to bring it with me when I left the house, because I vividly remember typing in Eric's address in my Maps app on my iPhone, because I didn't quite remember how to get to his house. The only thing I could do was run home, and luckily I didn't make it too far in my car before I spun out, because I would have had to have walked a lot further than the 3 or 4 miles that I had to walk. When I got home, I told my dad everything, and he was pissed. He managed to pull my car out of the ditch with his truck, and he had my mom drive it home. He ended up taking the keys from me, and he told me that we would talk about it all tomorrow, and I felt horrible for what I had done. I have actually never seen my dad that upset in my entire life. As I was lying in bed that night, I was still trying to figure out where my phone was. I was getting really angry because I had no idea what I did with it. I couldn't find it anywhere. I honestly thought that in my heart I lost it somehow when I crashed, and that it was buried in the snow somewhere. Even though that seemed extremely unlikely to me at the time, that's the only thing I could think of that felt somewhat logical. All of a sudden, I heard something that sounded like it came from outside. The jump scared me pretty bad, as I was deep in thought, and the last thing I expected was someone or something to be at my window. I chalked it up to be that it was probably just an animal, and I forgot about it completely with only a few minutes. I wish I wouldn't have let my guard down so fast, though, because maybe, just maybe, things would have went down a lot differently than they did that night. All of a sudden, I heard a knocking sound that right away I could tell came from my window. I turned my head and looked over at the window so fast that it hurt my neck. There was a guy standing there a few feet from the window outside looking in. I couldn't tell who it was or what he looked like because it was too dark. All I could make out was that he was kind of tall and had long hair, like the guy from earlier I thought. I couldn't believe what I saw, and I immediately ran to get my dad again. When we came back to my room, my bedroom window was wide open, and my phone was sitting on my bed. I had no idea what to make of it all at first, but it had to have been that man from earlier that I spoke with briefly after the crash. He must have followed me home. Why the hell would he have taken my phone? And if he was attempting to steal it, why would he bring it back? And if he was just trying to do a good deed, why the hell would he sneak through my damn window in the middle of the night instead of knocking on the front door like a normal person? Of course, we looked all over for him, hoping he wasn't still in our house. My dad and I spent over 20 minutes easily looking for him, but he was gone. We called the police, but there wasn't much we could do. With the little evidence we had, I could give them a description of the man, but that was about it. Just under a week later, I saw him once again. He was in our backyard in the middle of the night, doing who knows what. I walked outside as soon as I saw him, and I yelled at him from the back patio and told him to leave and to never come back. I got my dad as well, and once again, by the time my dad showed up to this scene, he was gone. I'm not sure what the hell this guy wanted or what he was trying to do, but I haven't seen him since the last time I just told you about. I still get the occasional thought about him, and that he's going to try to come back at some point, even though this happened 2 years ago. Needless to say, I learned my lesson that night about a couple things. Just a couple of years ago, I was going on a long road trip for work. I used to go on these trips often in my old job, but recent events ultimately led to me getting a new job. The roads were horrible, and if it weren't for work, I wouldn't have been driving. The snow was only getting worse, and it was only getting later and later into the night. I decided to stop at a nearby hotel that was up ahead, a few exits down on the highway. Hopefully, the roads will be clear in the morning, I thought, or at least better than they are now. When I arrived, I went to the front desk, and I told the worker I needed a room for the night. I paid for it, and I made my way to the room. I was thinking about going to sleep because, after all, I was exhausted from driving all day, but at the same time, I felt like I needed to move around. I had been driving all day like stated previously, so my body was sore from sitting in the same position for hours on end. If you have ever drove for a prolonged amount of time, then you would know what I'm talking about. I decided to get some food, and after I ate, I let my stomach digest, and I decided that I wanted to go for a quick swim in the pool. The hotel had a nice indoor pool, along with a hot tub. I was the only person at the pool, and it was quite relaxing and much needed. But then I noticed a guy out of the corner of my eye who startled me. He was on the far left side towards the back of the pool area, in a dark, dimly lit corner sitting down on one of the plastic chairs. I didn't notice him when I first arrived at the pool, nor did I notice him walking while I was there. I kind of just figured that maybe he was a lifeguard or someone that worked there, but he gave me the creeps. He kept staring at me, and every time I looked at him, he would look away. I started to feel weird, so I got out of the pool shortly after. I barely even dried off, and I walked back to my room. I put dry clothes on, and I walked out to the hall and headed to the main lobby area, so I could get myself something to drink and a few snacks before bed. When I got back into my room, I turned the TV on and settled in before I was going to try and sleep to help me relax a little. It wasn't too long after that I heard a noise that sounded like it came from the outside of my hotel room. It sounded much closer, though. There was no one in the room with me, not that I knew of anyways. I heard the noise again, except this time it was much louder, and I could definitely tell where it was coming from. I was almost 100% sure that it was coming from the bathroom in my room. I panicked, and I sat there for a few seconds, probably trying to rationalize the situation I was in as a coping mechanism. Part of me didn't want to believe what was happening, I'm sure. I finally snapped out of it, though, and the noise continued. I walked over to the bathroom, and I slowly opened the door, and what I saw was the most disturbing thing imaginable. It was the same man from earlier at the pool. He must have followed me to my room or something. I immediately tried to close the bathroom door, but he was way more than strong enough to overpower me. He ripped the door back open, and it flung me into the bathroom with him. He asked me if I wanted to make $50, and he took his pants off. He then grabbed me by the arm, but I bit his arm as hard as I could. He let go of his grip on me, and he slapped me in the face with his other hand. Luckily, he didn't knock me over when he hit me. I ran straight for the door, and I managed to escape the room, and I ran to the main lobby once again, and I told the worker at the front desk everything. He called the police right away, and the man got arrested. He was in fact a worker at the hotel, so he was fired as well. CCTV camera footage picked him up sneaking into my room when I was getting snacks at the vending machine. I don't know how he thought he was going to get away with this, but I'm glad nothing worse ended up happening. I'm 32, so Halloween isn't exactly as fun and exciting as it used to be. Usually I just put up some decorations, and on Halloween night, I'll hand out candy and spend the evening watching movies. This was in 2022. I spent most of my morning cleaning up my house and picking up candy from the store, preparing for trick-or-treaters that night. Then around 3, I left the door cracked open so I could hear if anyone was approaching, and then I turned on a movie. Our neighborhood isn't really the biggest, so we don't usually get a ton of kids, but this year it felt different. I hadn't had a single trick-or-treater for 2 hours. I got up and looked outside. The whole street was empty and quiet. I guess Halloween isn't as big of a thing as it used to be, but still I hoped I would get at least a few people, so I stayed ready for any possible stops at my place. It wasn't until 6:30 that I got the first ring at my doorbell. I got up and went to grab the candy bowl when I noticed there was someone looking into the house at me. They were wearing a costume with some kind of white mask that covered everything but their eyes. Obviously, I had left the door cracked open, but it was still weird to be looking into my house like that. I walked over and held out the bowl and told them to take a handful. It was as they reached into the bowl, though, that I realized they were alone. It was just this one person, and something about them seemed off. They were taller than most kids, and when I got a closer look at their eyes, I could tell they were older. The whites of their eyes were bloodshot, and I could faintly see dark circles under them. I thought it was weird, but I really didn't care too much, since no other trick-or-treaters were out. I also didn't want to embarrass them by calling them out. Maybe they were just some older-looking kid, I don't know. When they walked off, I set the bowl down and went back to the movie. I want to say 15 or so minutes went by before I heard a sound that sounded like a footstep right outside my front door. Thinking it was another trick-or-treater, I got up again, but when I turned around, my heart skipped a beat seeing a person standing inside my house. It was that same one that was here earlier, with the creepy white mask. He was standing by my front door still, but fully inside my home. "Can I help you?" He stared at me for a really intense few seconds before he backed out and left the house. I stood in shock for a moment before I went up to the front door. The person was walking down my driveway, but looked back several times as if they were trying to see if I was watching. I closed the door. Now this was strange. Not only did he enter my home, but why the hell did he come back anyway? I felt like there was no way it could be a kid now, and was almost definitely some creepy guy in a costume with some really disturbing intentions. I didn't feel safe with him wandering the streets on Halloween night with kids around, so I took my phone out to call the police and report him. I heard footsteps approaching the door again, but this time they didn't ring the doorbell or knock or anything. I quietly walked over and looked out the peephole to see who it was and what they were doing. Almost like they knew I was approaching the door, they called out, "Hello, I'm looking for my kid. Have you seen them? Hello." There was a man looking mid-40s, wearing regular clothes like a brown long-sleeved t-shirt and blue jeans. I didn't quite trust this though, and I'm glad I didn't. The man looked around for a moment, then leaned a little closer to the door. When he did, I could see dark circles under his eyes and could tell they were bloodshot. My face went pale. I backed away and quietly continued the call with the police in the other room. After a few minutes, I went back to check out the front door, and the man was gone. Police made it a few minutes later, where we quickly found a costume with a white mask hidden in a bush on the side of my property, clearly having been taken off in a rush. This was the man's attempt to pretend he was someone else. Unfortunately, they weren't able to find the man that night, though. I just really hope he wasn't able to follow through on whatever he was intending to do that night. Obviously, with his strange behavior, showing up to my house 3 times and pretending to be someone looking for his kid, he definitely had something disturbing planned. It was late October. I was a sophomore at university and lived in my dorm room with a girl named Kylie. She was a good roommate, everything considered, though we didn't always talk much. She was very social, and I was more closed off. Come Halloween weekend, though, she invited me to come to a party with her at a friend's house. She really thought I'd have fun and maybe make some new friends. Plus, it was at an actual house, so I wouldn't be cramped up in a dorm room all night. I initially rejected the offer, but after a bit of convincing, I decided to go. I picked up a really awful-looking ghost costume at Spirit Halloween, and at 8, Kylie ordered an Uber to drop us off at her friend's place. It was about 10 minutes from campus, but this wasn't a very big town, so it felt like we were in a whole new area. It was basically an empty road, with just this one large house on it. There were orange lights strung all over the outside, and tons of blow-up Halloween decorations. We headed inside, and it was surprisingly not that crowded. There were maybe 10 or 15 people, around my age. Anyway, we drank and played some games for several hours. It was actually kind of fun, and I was happy I went. By 1 a.m. though, I was tired and burned out. I found Kylie and asked if she wanted to go, but she was too drunk and said she was just going to spend the night. I didn't feel comfortable enough with any of the others to ask for a ride, especially since they were drunk and mostly all dudes. I stood outside while trying to figure out what to do. I opened up the Uber app, but I really wasn't trying to spend $30 for a 10-minute ride, not to mention I probably barely even had $30 in my bank account. I was definitely a little tipsy too, which certainly fogged my judgment. I ended up saying screw it, and decided I could just walk back to campus. A 10-minute car ride must be like a 35 to 40-minute walk, or at least that's what I thought. I headed down the road, leaving the bright lights of the house, and very quickly getting into the barren, dark, and eerie section of the road. The street lights were spread out really far, so I'd be in the light for a minute, then walk in the dark for several minutes before reaching the next light. It was pretty soon into the walk, though, that I noticed a car behind me. It was odd, because it seemed like they were parked on the side of the road, which I know I never walked past them, but every few minutes when I'd look back, they had moved further down the road toward me. I tried to keep an eye on them, but at one point I looked back and had suddenly lost sight of them. It was a bit foggy out, but I don't know where they went. Maybe they turned around. I kept walking, but increasingly got more uneasy, feeling like I was being watched from somewhere. 5 minutes went by, as I kept walking along the side of the road, before I heard a car engine behind me. I turned around and saw a car coming through the fog, and their headlights were off. They were slowing down too, and came rolling to a stop right beside me. There was a man in the front seat with a patchy beard and a strange smile. "Where are you heading?" "It's a bit late to be walking out here alone." I just said I was okay, and kept on walking, but the man inched forward in the car, matching my pace, and staying right beside me. "I'll give you a lift, you really shouldn't be out here." He yelled through his window, but through his voice, I could tell there was something different about him. As I started to say no thanks, I looked over at him. His smile was gone, and his face was tense. His eyes stared at me with an aggression, like he wasn't giving me a choice. I stuttered over my words, as the man suddenly stopped the car and swung his door open. He started quickly getting out, and just then, a pair of headlights broke through the fog. Another car was coming down the road. I sprinted to the middle of the street and started waving my arms for them to stop, and the creepy man went right back into his car. As the other car started to slow down, the man sped away. It turned out to be one of the guys from the party on his way home. Though I only recognized his face, I didn't even know his name. I told him what happened, and he gave me a lift back to campus. I don't think I'd ever sobered up faster than when that guy jumped out of his car, but honestly, if nobody had come to help, I probably would have been on the missing persons list right now, with zero evidence on where I could be. It was Halloween day. I was in 8th grade at the time, and my friend group felt like this year we were a little too old to be trick-or-treating. This would be the first year that we weren't going out though, and being that the previous 10 years, we'd always trick-or-treat on Halloween, we were left without anything to do. I mean, we didn't know what else there really was to do. Most of my group decided to just stay home and chill, maybe hand out candy or whatever, but me and my best friend Tyler thought otherwise. We wanted to do something, literally anything. That night, I went over to Tyler's place, and we came up with a plan to explore somewhere he'd heard about. To the best of our knowledge, it was some kind of abandoned tunnel or underground mine, or something that was abandoned in the woods just a few miles south of our town. Now, I'd heard of it briefly before too, but neither of us really knew what it was. Tyler was able to get some directions from a buddy of his, so with the plan set, we hopped on our bikes and rode to the other side of town. There were a lot of people out walking around, but very few cars, and as we got closer to the woods, there were way less houses and obviously way less people as well. Both of us kind of expected other kids to have the same idea as us, so not seeing anyone out here only made us more excited. We locked up our bikes around a nearby tree, then headed down a small footpath that was right where Tyler's friend said it would be. This was very clearly not a real trail, just something that formed from other people going this way. It was muddy, overgrown, and really easy to accidentally lose track of. Several times we had to stop and turn around to figure out where the path was. Obviously, it was dark out, and Tyler only had one flashlight at his place, so I was just following close behind him as he lit up the way. I want to say it took about 40 minutes of walking for us to finally reach a clearing in the trees. On the other side of the clearing, there was the entrance to the tunnel. It was a small hole going into the side of a hill, and from that far, it was just completely pitch black beyond the entrance. We were pretty sure now that it was some kind of old mine though. Tyler walked up to the opening, and I stayed right behind him. He shined his light in, and it was honestly really creepy. It was extremely dusty, and was just this rugged rock tunnel that looked like it was endless. At one point before we entered, I instinctively looked behind us at the woods we came from, and for an instant, I thought I saw something move. It was by one of the trees near the path. I immediately told Tyler to shine his light over there, but when scanning the area, we saw nothing. I didn't know if I was just scaring myself, or if I actually saw something, but being with my buddy gave me a false sense of confidence. Tyler moved the light back into the tunnel, then we both hesitantly stepped in. The dust particles fluttered across the beam of light as we slowly made our way down. It was really quiet in there, and each footstep echoed through the tunnel for an eerie amount of time, almost like it was miles long. We didn't get too far in though, before we heard something ahead of us. It sounded like a voice. It was quiet, like they were whispering, but the echo carried the sound close enough for us to hear it. Tyler held his light steady as far down the tunnel as it could go, but there was still an endless pit of darkness beyond it. Almost like we read each other's minds, both of us simultaneously pivoted and started quickly walking back toward the opening. As we walked away, I could hear the voices behind us getting louder. Either they were talking louder or they were coming up behind us, but every time I looked back, it was entirely darkness, even just 5 feet away. We finally made it to the opening, and just then, Tyler stopped abruptly. Standing just 10 yards away was an unknown man. He was in the middle of the clearing, looking like he was just walking toward the opening we were coming from. Both of us bolted out, and straight for the trees. I didn't have the courage to turn around to check if he chased us. Eventually, though, we ran out of breath and slowed down, to which we were able to go in the general direction back to town. As we walked back, we talked about what the hell just happened. What we think is that the man we saw outside the tunnel was likely going to trap us inside, or at least block our way out. I mean, why else would a grown man be alone in the woods on Halloween night, exploring an abandoned place that he knew kids would probably be going to? It doesn't make any sense. As for the people inside the mine, it could have been other kids, or someone working with the man in the woods. We got really lucky, though, to have turned around and left when we did, because even 10 seconds later, that man could have been at the entrance, blocking our only way out, and forcing us further into the tunnel. I enjoyed it too. I don't necessarily want kids of my own, but I'm kind of the cool aunt who lets the rules slide just enough for the kids to give glowing reviews of me when the parents got home. If they were old enough to talk, that is. I did it for a long time, without getting stuck with any nightmare children, but my luck did run out eventually. This one kid, Carter, almost made me quit babysitting altogether. I was already apprehensive to babysitting, as he was on the older side at 10 years old, which is about the age when kids get more complicated. However, it was for a whole week, Monday through Friday, so the money was just too good to pass up. All my classes were online, so I could study the whole time and have the whole weekend to myself. When I met the parents, I felt better about things. They were both very nice people, and Carter seemed like a normal, lazy kid. They said he mostly spent his time playing video games. and had a pretty set diet of easy-to-make stuff. They told me not to bother trying to get him to clean his room, and just to keep the rest of the house tidy. At that point, I thought the week was going to be a cinch. But then the parents left, and Carter switched up right away. He started running laps around the house, making loud engine sounds as he passed by me. At first, I thought I should let him expel some energy, since I wasn't told to enforce any rules about running. However, Carter bumped into a table, seemingly on purpose, and came very close to breaking a glass vase. So I had to lay down the law. Carter didn't take well to being told not to run. He got angry and argued with me about it for a bit, before I sent him to his room to play video games. He left, but before he slammed the door, he looked straight at me from down the hall and said, "I don't like you," in the typical mocking tone of an angry little boy. That was definitely the worst possible foot we could have started off on, so to speak. But I didn't worry about it being much worse than that. Of course, it wasn't that simple. It seemed like Carter was intentionally testing every single boundary of what he could get away with. When I picked them up and knocked on his door to tell him to put them away, I discovered the absolute den of clutter and chaos that was his room. And God, his parents didn't make me do anything about it. On top of that, he had his game console in there, which he played at the max volume until I told him to turn it down. He was definitely disobeying his bedtime every single night, but I couldn't do much about that. I just had to ignore the sounds of explosions and screaming while I was trying to study. Carter wasn't just a poorly behaved, spoiled brat either. He was also a little creep. For a 10-year-old, he sure knew a lot of dirty words and things about how intimate physical actions were carried out. On Thursday, I noticed he smelled awful. I knew I would have to get him to take a shower, but it was a horrible struggle forcing him to do it. After an hour of fighting over it, he finally went into the bathroom and turned on the shower. Then, for the first time all week, I had a chance to go into his room without him being there. I couldn't help my curiosity. I had to know what other nasty secrets this kid had. After a bit of digging, I found an odd little handmade booklet. It was titled, "All the Ways I Want to Kill Susan." The first page said, "I hate Susan so much. If I knew she wouldn't tattle to my parents, I'd punch her." Then, there was a bad drawing of a giant fist smashing my face. Things just got worse as I kept turning the pages. There were lots of spelling errors, but the message was clear. Susan makes me put away my guns. I want to shoot her, followed by a machine gun turning me into Swiss cheese. Susan doesn't let me run in the house. I want to cut off her feet with a drawing of 2 bloody stumps and severed feet. If Susan wasn't so ugly, I would F her to death with the full curse word, followed by a graphic depiction of something I don't want to talk about. Watching her sleep in my parents' bed made me want to set the house on fire. The picture had me burning alive in bed, screaming for help as Carter watched. I was mortified. I quickly took pictures of everything and sent them to his parents. But before I could get any reply, I heard a voice behind me. It was Carter. He was fully clothed, holding a pocket knife. He said he was going to kill me. Then he charged at me. I quickly got out of the way and ran out of the room, slamming his door shut. I held it closed for dear life as Carter started stabbing the door. I was able to hold the door closed with one hand and called his parents to tell them what was happening. They didn't believe me until they went and looked at the photos I sent them. But they still asked me to stay the last night and wait for them to get there. There was no chance of that happening. They had a family friend come over to watch Carter for the night. I took my payment and packed up all my stuff, never to go near that neighborhood again, even after taking a few weeks off. That freak monster of a kid scarred me. I dread to think what he'll become when he gets older. There's something extremely wrong with him. When I lost my husband to a car crash, it felt like my heart had been cleaved in two. I left everything behind. My old neighborhood, my friends, the home that Marcus and I had built together. Because everything was too painful. Our 6-year-old son Daniel and I moved into a quiet tree-lined neighborhood where no one knew us or our grief. I figured a fresh start might help both of us. Our little house was modest but cozy, with a large living room window overlooking the street. Daniel quickly settled into his new school routine, and I took comfort in seeing a bit of his usual brightness returning, especially after his first few days at school. One afternoon, I walked into the living room and found him by the window, a tiny hand raised in an enthusiastic way. "Who are you waving to, sweetie?" I asked, amused. "Oh, just a friend," he replied with a shy grin. I smiled, relieved. Making friends already, I thought. I saw that as a good sign. Maybe things really would get better here. The next afternoon, there he was again, by the window, waving down at the empty street. This time, I approached him to see who it was. "You should invite your friend over sometime," I suggested, ruffling his hair and peering at the empty street. "It'd be nice to meet him." Daniel glanced up at me, his face serious. "Arthur's a little shy, Mommy." "Arthur?" I tried not to read too much into the name. Maybe somebody names their kid after their parents. Then came the oddities. A week or so passed, and Daniel's behavior grew unsettling. I'd catch him talking in his sleep, mumbling words too quiet to understand, sometimes laughing softly in the darkness. There were nights I'd wake up to find him standing by the window, staring out into the blackness. When I'd ask him what he was looking at, he'd just mumble, "Arthur likes the night." Then the worst happened. I'd been tidying his room. His crayons were left scattered across the floor. There, on a crumpled piece of paper, was a face. Pale, hollowed eyes staring up at me, surrounded by scratchy, childlike lines. In the middle of the forehead was a small, dark red dot. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was staring right through me. When Daniel got home, I held up the drawing, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who's this Daniel?" He looked at me in a way that made my skin prickle. A stare so cold, so distant, it couldn't belong on a 6-year-old's face. Seconds passed, stretching out painfully, and just when I thought he wouldn't answer, he turned his gaze to the window. Slowly, as if reluctant, he whispered, "That's Arthur, Mommy." I froze, swallowing the lump in my throat. I forced a smile. "Oh, why does he have a red dot on his forehead?" Without looking at me, he replied, "Because he has a hole there. Arthur said a bad man shot him." I felt the blood drain from my face. It wasn't just an imaginary friend's story. It was something chillingly specific in his words. I pulled him close. "Daniel, how did you meet Arthur?" He looked up at me, eyes innocent and young. "He was there, Mommy, at Daddy's funeral. He was standing right next to Daddy's grave." A sickening chill ran through me, freezing my breath in my throat. "Where is he now?" Daniel's gaze drifted to the living room window. His little face was eerily calm. "He's not shy anymore, Mommy. He wants to come in." He paused, his mouth stretching into a small, strange smile. That was enough for me. I grabbed him as I rushed us out of the house. I didn't stop until we were safe at my mother's. My hands shook. My mind spiraled in fear and confusion. I needed help. Real help. For the next 2 weeks, we prayed. My mother insisted we go to church. She dragged us every day without fail. A bishop performed a cleansing ritual, muttering prayers over us as he sprinkled holy water on Daniel and me. I clung to hope, desperate for the nightmare to end. Slowly, gradually, the shadows faded and the whispers stopped. The nights returned to their silent, ordinary darkness. Then Arthur, he vanished. It was exactly a year later when I returned to the cemetery. I brought flowers and knelt by Marcus' grave. I whispered a few words, telling him how we were doing and how Daniel was growing up so quickly. As I rose to leave, my gaze fell on the grave beside his. A simple, unassuming stone that hadn't been there before. Curious, I stepped closer and read the inscription. Arthur Miller, an ideal son and a loving husband, gone too soon on the battlefield, fighting for his country. Everyone who knew him will always be proud of him. A single red poppy had been placed by the stone. Its delicate petals were bright and stark against the grass, just over a small circular indent in the stone's surface. A scar left by something small, round, and sharp. A shiver coursed through me. I could almost feel eyes on me, watching from somewhere just beyond the veil of reality. At that moment, I could have sworn I heard Daniel's small, haunting voice in my head, echoing through the silent graveyard. "He's not shy anymore, Mommy. He wants to come in." I used to babysit my little brother Joey a lot. He was fairly easy to take care of. He was only in kindergarten, but he walked home from the bus stop every day and could make himself a PB&J, among other things, so he was pretty independent for his age. He was also very capable of entertaining himself with toys and drawing, so I got to do my own thing. One day, though, while our parents were gone, I was bored and felt like Joey might be lonely. He was on the floor of his bedroom, drawing with the door open. I asked if I could come in, and he said yes. I went over to him and looked at what he was working on. There were 3 other drawings on the floor, crude portraits of me and our mom and dad. Joey was scribbling together a 4th portrait, but I didn't recognize it. I didn't interrupt him, though. I just watched it come together. It was a man, but Joey only bothered to draw the details of the top half of his face before grabbing a red crayon and scribbling a giant triangle over where his nose and mouth would have been. As Joey filled the triangle in with a bunch of swirls, I noticed that the size of the head matched the size of the portraits of our parents, being bigger than mine or Joey's, signaling that the person was an adult, whoever they were. However, when Joey finished the drawing and gathered the other ones to arrange them, he put our mom and dad together on top, then below them, me, the unknown man, and Joey, in that order, as if he was a kid like us. I asked Joey who the man was. He replied very plainly, "That's the bandana man," he said. I asked if that was his imaginary friend, and in the same nonchalant tone he said, "No, he's real." I was a bit worried, so I asked a few more questions. Apparently, the man wore the bandana so he wouldn't get sick. This was during that time period, so that sort of checked out. Joey also said that he and the unless the bandana man was imaginary, because I knew Joey had only been playing alone. Unfortunately, when I asked if they had been playing past his bedtime, he stopped answering. I could tell he was getting annoyed with me, so I figured I should drop it for the moment. A few hours passed, and our parents came home. By then, Joey had put all the drawings on the fridge. When my parents saw the bandana man, they were also concerned. However, they weren't able to get any more information out of Joey than me. We all figured Joey had conjured it up after seeing a cowboy movie or something, and tried not to fixate on it. But the drawing was right there in the kitchen, staring at me every time I sat down to eat a bowl of cereal in the morning. I couldn't get the image out of my head. One evening, on a Saturday, my parents were going to some big dinner party and said they wouldn't be home until around midnight, so we were supposed to be asleep when they arrived. I got Joey into bed around 9, but I stayed up for another hour or so before I went to bed. I lied awake for what must have been 30 minutes. Then I started to hear Joey talking to himself or his imaginary friend. I knew he wasn't supposed to be awake, but I didn't get up to tell him to go back to bed just then. I was very comfortable and didn't want to move. I contemplated letting Joey get in trouble if he got caught, or maybe just hollering at him from my bed. But after a few minutes, something else happened. There was a very light knock on my door, then Joey's voice asking if he could come in. I said yes, and as he slowly opened the door, Joey said, "The bandana man wants to play with you." My blood ran ice cold when I saw a tall man standing behind Joey wearing a red bandana as a mask. As I stared in shock and disbelief, the bandana man entered my room and approached my bed. I could hear his breath, heavy and excited. His eyes were wide with hunger. Then Joey spoke again. "He doesn't want to play with me tonight. Just you," he said. Then he closed the door. I finally snapped out of it and screamed at the top of my lungs. I tried to jump out of the bed to run, but the man pounced on me, pinning me down. I kept screaming and trying to get away, but he crawled over me, keeping my arms down with his knees. He took the bandana from his face and stuffed it into my mouth. Then he undid his belt and tightly wrapped it around my head to keep it in place. Just as I realized there was no way out of what was about to happen to me, I heard my dad calling out that he was home and that we had better be in bed. A moment later, he started scolding Joey for being up. Suddenly, the man jumped off me and ran out of the room. My dad shouted at him, and I heard him start to run, but the man managed to get back into Joey's room and escaped through the window. I took that crap off my face and screamed louder than I ever had, immediately beginning to cry. I sobbed for a long time before I was able to say anything about what happened. I told the police everything, and they questioned Joey about it. The bandana man had befriended Joey one day on his walk home from the bus stop. Everybody was wearing a mask around that time, so he didn't stick out. He came into Joey's window every night and came to play with Joey, asking him questions about us and our parents, gathering information. When he knew our parents wouldn't be home for the night, he finally asked Joey to take him to me. If my parents hadn't come home an hour early because my mother wasn't feeling well, that would have been the worst hour of my life, potentially my last. I met Jack outside of a restaurant at one of the lowest points of my life. My boyfriend of over 2 years was leaving me for my best friend. He said that we have lost our spark, whatever that's supposed to mean. But that breakup is now a blessing, because here I am getting married to one of the greatest guys on earth. After exchanging our wedding vows and all the wedding festivities, we made our way out of the church and jumped into our car, ready to start our new life together. Jack had booked a small cabin for us to spend 2 weeks on our honeymoon together. Upon reaching our location, I was a little concerned about the isolation, but remained quiet because I knew Jack had to pull a lot of work into planning this getaway. We packed our things in a boat that visitors used to cross the lake. We began to make our way across the lake to the cabin. After reaching the house, I realized that the island lacked modern amenities such as electricity, television, internet, and running water. In fact, there wasn't even phone reception here. Jack saw my frustration and asked if I wanted to leave, but I said no. We're already here, so we might as well make the best of it. After entering into the cabin, I noticed over the fireplace 4 photos of 4 young ladies. I didn't think anything of it, so we settled in. When I woke up the following morning, I noticed that Jack had placed the car keys and all our money in a safe box, holding the safe box key near him like a locket. I asked him why he was doing that, and he just said it was for safety, so that we didn't lose anything. I pushed it out of my mind, and I started to enjoy myself on the island. I went for swims, sunbathing, and just enjoying nature to the fullest. After a couple days of this routine, it kind of became boring, and I was ready to go home. So I proposed to Jack that we shorten our honeymoon and go back to civilization. Jack, however, seemed preoccupied and disregarded what I was saying to him, focusing instead on setting up an animal trap. In the night, I was unable to sleep. I just wanted to go home. So in the morning, I told him again that I wanted to leave this place, stating that 10 days in nature is more than enough. Jack bluntly responded that 10 days was not enough, and that I was not leaving this island anytime soon. What? I responded. What do you mean that I'm not leaving this island anytime soon? Jack's tone now turned threatening and said, "We are here to stay. You are not leaving." I now realized that the man I fell in love with truly has a dark side. To keep things calm, I walked off and went inside the cabin. The following morning, I began to plead with him, saying that if you love me, that you'll let us leave this place, that I just wanted to go home. But something about Jack suddenly changed. His eyes turned a bright red, and he looked at me saying, "You are just like the others." On repeat, "You're just like the others." He reached for the knife on the table and rushed towards me. I sprinted out of the cabin and grabbed a piece of firewood, striking him on the head. As he was on the ground, I grabbed the key to the safe box from around his neck. Then I rushed inside to open the box and took out the car keys and made my way towards the boat. While leaving this wretched island, I looked back and noticed that Jack was awake and started to swim after me. Reaching the other side of the lake, I quickly ran towards the area I think that we parked at, making my way towards the vehicle. Suddenly, I tripped over something. Upon closer observation, I realized that it seemed to be 4 separate graves. Suddenly, I heard Jack screaming out my name in the distance, "Jill." With no time to think, I rushed towards the car, but it refused to start. Jack was now right up against the driver's window, shouting at me to come out. Just then, I remembered that we always kept a gun in the glove compartment of the car, so I pulled it out and I ordered him to fix the car. He told me to open the car bonnet, but it was a trick. When I looked down for the thing that opened the car bonnet, I heard a loud smash. The next day, I woke up tied to a tree with ropes. Jack's demeanor totally changed as he just kept saying, "You are just like the others." Again and again, "You are just like the others." "What others?" I asked. This is where he started to explain. My other 4 wives wanted to leave as well, so I had to kill them. But wife number 5, I was hoping would be different. "You mean the 4 photos inside with those ladies? The 4 graves near our car? My God, you killed them?" "Yeah, I did. And you the next." He left me tied up and went to the other side of the house, but when I realized that he wasn't in sight, I rubbed the rope on a sharp stone nearby to break it. After a few seconds, he was coming back with an axe in his hands. I rushed into the house, saw the gun and shouted at him to stop, but he kept coming towards me with the axe. So I pulled the trigger, hitting him in the chest. He fell to the ground, unable to move. I stood above him with the guns in my hand, pointed at him. I couldn't finish him off, so I tossed the gun towards him and made my way off the island. When I was halfway to the other side, I heard a loud boom. "My name's Ethan. And yeah, I've heard it all before. You're too old for this. But they don't get it. The Grinch isn't just a character to me. He's something more. I mean, I'm a sucker for this stuff. Posters, toys, collector's items, you name it, I have it. My house is literally like the Grinch exploded in it. People tend to think it's quirky or weird, but they don't see what I see. The Grinch was clever and misunderstood. A genius. But things went sideways last Christmas. It started in a flea market. Just walking through, scouring over all the tables for any Grinch, I saw an old dusty Grinch toy perched atop some wonky table. It was unlike any other I've ever seen, though. Fur matted, green plotting instead of richly vibrant, and eyes. And glow kinda almost like they're breathing in that dim light. When I picked it up, it was warm. Not warm like it sat out in the sun all day. Warm like if it were alive. My chest constricted, and I reassured myself that it was just my excitement. "How much?" I asked the seller. The old man behind the table didn't even look at me. "Take it," he muttered. "No charge." I should have walked away, but I didn't. I sat the toy on my shelf, right in the middle of my Grinch collection. It was perfect there. Too perfect. As I gazed at it, a creeping, crawling feeling went up my spine as if it looked back at me. Then the whispers started. I thought it might just be the wind, or perhaps the neighbors, but it was whispered inside the house. Faint, soft, just out of earshot. They seemed to come from nowhere, and from everywhere, and it only got worse. Every time I passed a mirror, my reflection seemed off. My nose looked longer, my cheeks hollowed. One night, I swore I saw my face twist into a Grinch-like grin before snapping back to normal. The decorations around my house seemed different somehow. The Grinches on my shelf seemed to shift when I wasn't paying attention. Their smiles grew thinner, their eyes deeper. I tried to think myself into agreement with my mind, but the fact remained within me. I knew, and then the dreams came. I saw him every night, the Grinch, but it was not the playful mischievousness of his daily endeavors. He was taller and leaner, his green fur darker, more patchy. His grin went on too long, and jagged and sharp were his teeth. I envisioned him standing at the foot of my bed. He watched me, whispering things I couldn't understand. "Follow me," he said one night in a deep guttural voice. I wake up drenched in sweat, with my heart racing. That was when I started digging. I needed answers. I spent days researching and surfing all obscure forums and old books dedicated to Christmas folklore. And that's how I found the legend of a cursed Grinch toy. According to the stories, it wasn't only a collector's item. It was a trap. It pulled people in, feeding on their obsession, slowly turning them into what they so admired. Something inside me didn't want to believe it, but the signs were there. Whispers, distorted reflections, and dreams. I tried to eliminate the toy. I threw it in the trash. But the next morning, there it was back on my shelf. I burned it, but it came back. Its fur singed, its grin even wider. I was losing my mind. Christmas Eve. That's when I finally saw myself. This time, however, it wasn't me. The face in the mirror was green, and its grin was stitched into its cheeks. I screamed and punched the glass, but the image didn't break. That's when I realized I wasn't just seeing the Grinch. I was becoming him. The next thing I remember is standing in my bathroom, staring into the mirror with a knife in my hand. Blood was dripping from my cheeks because I carved out a grin. All I can recall is looking back at an awful distorted grin. Now I'm here, locked away in this mental institution. They say I'm dangerous, that I hurt myself and scared my neighbors. But they don't understand. The Grinch is real. He's here. I can hear the guards talking about me every now and then. "Poor guy," one of them said. "His obsession destroyed him." The other replied, "Yeah, who carves a grin into their own face. They don't know what I know. They can laugh all they want. But every night I see him, the Grinch, standing in the corner of my room, his grin wider than ever. He's waiting. For what? I don't know. But I can feel it. He's not done with me yet." I visited my parents for Christmas last year. It had been snowing since October, so my dad helped me switch over to winter tires over a month earlier. That made me think I didn't have to worry much about road conditions. My family and I had a wonderful Christmas together, but I had plans to go on vacation with a friend the following day. Our flight was scheduled for that afternoon. I left in the early morning when it was still dark out, so I could have ample time to prepare for the trip and arrive at the airport. Unfortunately, I hadn't paid enough attention to how much snow had fallen the previous night. I quickly realized that the winter tires alone might not cut it, but I was determined to get home. Once there, I could just get a ride. Unfortunately, there was a dark and lonely 20 miles between me and my destination. I pressed on at a cautious speed. Everything seemed fine until I crossed over a small bridge. Then out of nowhere, I hit a patch of black ice. My car rotated one way and started sliding the other way. Completely out of my control, I rammed into a pile of snow underneath. But thankfully, I wasn't going fast enough to cause any damage to the car. On the other hand, the snow caved in under one tire, causing me to get stuck. I tried not to panic. I had never had to get myself out of snow before, but my dad told me how. When I stepped out, though, all my confidence was blown away by the brutally cold wind and the realization that I was completely alone on that stretch of road. When I refocused, I grabbed all the floor mats from the back seat and the box of cat litter from the trunk. I got on my hands and knees and cleared a path for my back tires, packing down the softer snow into hard ice. I laid down the litter with mats and tried as hard as I could to cram them under the tires. I was working under the light of a single flashlight, feeling like I was on a fast track to hypothermia as my fingers started to get stiff and my face went numb. Just as I was ready to give it a try, I saw a pair of headlights approaching behind me. I flagged them down, trying to warn them about the ice. They seemed to go over it with no problem, and as they pulled over next to me, I saw that they had chains in their tires. It was another larger SUV, driven by a scruffy middle-aged man with gloves on who offered to help. I declined, saying I was already taking care of it, but then he took a glance at my setup and said there was no chance of that working. He hopped out of his car, revealing a stained jacket over a large gut, saying he helped tow me from the ditch. I told him again that I had things handled, but he glared at me, demeaning. He said a little lady like me couldn't handle anything on her own, and that I was no good to anyone if I froze to death. I was offended. My teeth were chattering so much I couldn't go off on him for being such a chauvinist, and what I could get out was lost in the wind. All I could do was watch him pop open his trunk and pull out a long chain, which he looped through an attachment point under the front bumper of my car. Then, he told me to kneel there and hold it while he grabbed something to lock it in place. I managed to ask him why he didn't just tie the chain in a knot, but he snapped at me, asking if I knew anything about towing cars. I tried to snap back by saying I never asked for a tow, but he pointed at my floor mats and cat litter and said it was the stupidest, most brain-dead method of getting out of snow. If he left, he said I'd be stuck there all morning until the snow plows came to bury me. In the freezing cold, looking at my handiwork once again, I had to admit the tow seemed like a better option. I swallowed my pride and did as he said, kneeling at the hood of the car with the chain in my hands. A moment later, the man returned, handing me an open padlock. I noticed he was holding one hand behind his back, which as he stood looming over me, was no good only. My inner voice was screaming at me at this point that my initial feelings about this guy were right. However, I tried to keep going along with things while still being extra cautious, so I kept one eye on him as I turned away to secure the chain. I only got the lock through one link before I saw him raise his arms over his head out of the corner of my eye. I looked over my shoulder and saw a hammer ready to strike me in the back of the head. I quickly jumped out of the way just before he slammed into the bumper. I yanked the chain out from under my car, whipping it across his face as he went to hit me again. He shouted in pain as I ran around to the passenger side, jumping in and locking the doors just moments before he reached the window and started hammering the glass. I crawled over to the driver's seat, praying I wouldn't be stuck. I heard my dad's voice again saying, "Don't floor it." So against my panicking instincts, I feathered the throttle until I felt the tires catch, and then I finally slammed on the gas pedal. I roared out of the ditch, speeding off to safety. The creep didn't come after me, but he smashed my window. When I got home, I called the police immediately and reported everything. But since I didn't have the license plate, they didn't really do much. The rest of my day was very strange, trying to go through with my trip after what happened. It's horrible to think that there's a kind of person in this world that goes around looking for people in need of help just to take advantage of their vulnerability. I used to work at a 7-Eleven that closed at midnight on Christmas Eve. I worked that closing shift one year. I wasn't supposed to be alone, but my coworker knew called no show. The night was painfully slow. After 11:30, no more people were coming in, so I started getting ready to close. I got almost everything done, then I went to count the register. I was about to open the drawer when I heard a faint noise coming from outside. It sounded like jingle bells. As I paused to listen to it, the sound got louder and closer. I looked outside and saw a man dressed as Santa Claus. He was crossing the street, heading right for the store. While he walked, he shook a leather strap of jingle bells in one hand. He was staring right at me, even at a distance and through the glass door. I could tell. He came all the way up to it, then he stopped just outside. He went silent, no longer shaking his bells, just staring at me. He had a strange look in his eyes. It wasn't like a crazy or high person. It was different. They were so empty, yet so full of joy. I looked away at the clock. It was 11:57, so I couldn't bar him from the store. Against my better judgment, I welcomed him in. He opened the door and took one step inside, then stepped on the floor mat, still staring at me. He made a sudden and unnerving series of deep shouts. Ho ho ho! It took me a moment to realize that was his version of Ho ho ho. It sounded like one of those holiday greeting cards with a worn-out tape recording. Standing in the same spot, he asked what a little boy like me was still doing out. I replied that I was working and the store closed at midnight, but he said I was being naughty and needed to go to sleep so he could put my presents under the tree. I kept being straight with him and said there was no tree and that he needed to buy something. To that, he scoffed and said Santa Claus never buys anything on Christmas. No, Good little boys and girls are supposed to leave milk and cookies out for him. That's when he raised his strap of jingle bells and shook it as he started walking. He took the last cookie on display that I was saving for myself. Then he went over to the coolers. He grabbed a bottle of whole milk, cracked it open, then proceeded to unwrap the cookie and cram the whole thing into his mouth in about 2 bites, washing it down with an entire bottle of milk. I shouted at him that he was going to have to pay for that, but he just glanced over at me and jingled his stupid bells again. After clearing his throat, he thanked me for the milk and cookies, but told me that I still had to go to sleep if I wanted to receive my present. I said I wasn't going to play his game, and that in 1 minute I was going to kick him out, but he just rang his bells again, then said he could be very patient. We locked eyes for the next 60 seconds. When the clock struck midnight, I told him the store was closed, and without skipping a beat, he started violently shaking his bells and screamed, "Merry Christmas," at the top of his lungs. I got fed up and went to confront him. I pointed to the door and told him to leave, but instead of listening, he shook his damn bells again and spoke to me like a child. He said he was proud of me for staying up all the way until midnight to see Santa putting out presents, but it was time for me to go to sleep unless I wanted to be put on the naughty list. I finally lost my cool and shouted in his face to get the hell out. In response, he took the strap of bells into 2 hands, holding them horizontally chest-high as he stepped forward to close the gap between us. I started backpedaling toward the register, not taking my eyes off him as he followed mere inches away. I told him he didn't have to pay, but he didn't care. He just told me it was my bedtime. I kept trying to reason with him, saying I still had to close the store, but then the man raised his voice, scolding me for talking back to him. I apologized, but he said it was already too late. I was on the naughty list, and since I wouldn't go to bed on my own, Santa would have to put me to bed himself, and I was no longer going to get what I wanted for Christmas. Before I could ask what he meant, I realized I was backed up against the counter, and he was right on top of me. Suddenly, he pushed me down and wrapped the leather strap of bells around my neck, squeezing and pressing into it with all his weight. I kicked and fought against him, trying to pull the strap away, but I was completely overpowered. All I could hear was him screaming, "Ho, Merry Christmas." As the seconds passed, my vision faded, my strength vanished. The last thing I remember is him getting in my face and whispering. Nothing was stirring, not even a mouse. Then, everything went black, and I could no longer feel. I don't know how long I was like that, but to my surprise, I woke up in a daze. I hadn't been moved, but now there was a horrid sensation in my mouth. I grabbed for it and pulled out a dead rat. I threw it across the store. Looking at it, I realized that its entire nose and mouth were covered in red wax, like it had been suffocated to death prior to being stuffed in my mouth. I would have taken a lump of coal in my mouth over a dead Rudolph rat any day. When I got up, I called the police. Apparently, the Santa Claus guy had been terrorizing and assaulting people with his demented Santa Claus act all night, but my case appeared to be the worst. I always hoped they would find the guy, but many years had passed, and I haven't heard anything about it. The story dates back to when I was just a young child, to now as a 19-year-old almost adult, to before I was even born. I didn't live in the worst or best neighborhood. It was a neighborhood where if you left your bike out, it was almost guaranteed to get stolen within just a day. It's not like there was a murder reported every other day, just a neighborhood where people liked to steal bikes and maybe rob a lawn mower out of your shed. Anyways, me and my family have been victims of these things multiple times. It started off when my dad's truck got robbed before I was even born, and he had some tools in his work bag stolen. We had no idea at the time that the same person would be targeting us for years. One day, my mom was active and doing things in the house when I and my dad were sleeping. My mother told me this story, by the way. She was doing some cleaning until she heard a commotion in the bathroom. She went in and then saw a teenager or a young adult climbing through the window. She described him as youngish, blind, and he wasn't even wearing a ski mask or anything, just a black hoodie. She said that he stared at her for a moment, and then slowly climbed out of the window and then left. My mom said she wasn't scared of him and didn't wake up my dad because she was scared he would have chased the kid down and kicked his ass. My dad was an intimidating guy, well over 6 foot, closer to 6 feet 6 inches or so, broad shoulder frame built like a truck, and super protective of his family. The point is, he would have torn the dude apart if my mom had woken him up. Anyways, my mom ended up telling my dad, and he was pissed. Both my mom and dad say the guy would walk up and down the streets trying car door handles, looking in car windows, and sometimes even going up to houses and trying the handle on those. My dad would even sit there and look out the window just waiting for him to try a handle. Yeah, my dad really wanted to mess that guy up. Fast forward a couple of years, I was probably 6 years old, and my mother and my father and I were in the living room. We were hanging out on the couches and whatever, when the handle of our door started to jiggle. My dad jumped up and swung the door open, just to see the same dumb-ass kid running down the block. For years this jackass had been at the same dumb home break and robber act. Fast forward again to age 12. I was sleeping in the living room on the couch for whatever reason that night. I woke up at like 3 a.m., so there was some kind of noise. I remember looking around the room and then just taking a sip of whatever I was drinking. Then out of nowhere, I heard the door handle jiggle, an actual banging on the door. I got up, ran into my grandpa's room, and woke him up. I told him someone had been trying to break into the house. Then he sprang up and ran to the front door. He forcefully swung open the door and then ran out onto the front porch. Nobody was there. It could have been completely unrelated to the stranger guy, but what are the odds of that? Fast forward to present day. Today we woke up and one of our cars was stolen. We filed a police report, and then my grandpa had a smart idea. My grandpa is good friends with all of our neighbors, but especially with our neighbor across the street from us. He went over, explained the situation to him, and asked if he could pull up his camera footage. He did, and around 3:40 earlier this morning, there was a sketchy, tall, lanky guy looking into his car windows and tried the handle in one of them. We knew then exactly who it was. We couldn't see his face on the camera, but just by the build of the guy, we knew it was him. His cameras only picked up his yard, but after the guy left, I'm guessing he went straight across the street to our car. We very stupidly left the keys in it, and the doors unlocked. I guess it is partly our fault, but I'll be sure to update you guys if anything else happens. Thanks for listening, and hopefully y'all have a better day than I did. This happened in the late summer of 2014, but I remember it clearly even 10 years later. In the fall of the previous year, I moved into an apartment with my boyfriend at the time. I was freshly 18, and he was 22. He was a socially inept groomer. Let's call him Mike. Mike was always emotionally distant and strange. We had many shared interests, but he refused to let me have friends, make new friends, or just go out and enjoy life in the city. I'd invite him to concerts for bands he liked, and he'd always decline. I'd offer to introduce him to my friends, but he'd decline. I'd go out to a show with my friends or go hang out with my friends, and he'd send me a Word document, a deranged poetic slide describing every single fault of mine he could discern. One time I smoked pot, and he compared me to Medea killing her children. When I say poetic, I mean poetic, and when I say deranged, I mean deranged. Naturally, we broke up. A friend of mine found him on a dating website, and that was it. My parents helped me lug his stuff into a truck, and took him and all of his crap to his parents' house. It was a done deal. I kept the apartment and tried to settle back in. It was fine. I enjoyed my alone time, and I was now free to have friends visit. It seemed ideal. Upon falling asleep on my second night alone, I was quickly woken up by a knock on my door. I checked the time. It was maybe 3 to 4 a.m., I think. Yeah, screw that. No thanks. I tried to drift off again, but the knocking happened again, more rapidly and more aggressively this time. I kept ignoring it. I didn't have that many friends, and the friends I did have wouldn't be banging on my door at 3 a.m. Eventually, the banging stopped. I enjoyed my next 3 days. I went out with my friends, had some drinks, then came home alone and went to sleep. I was then awoken again by 3 loud bangs, and again at 4 a.m. What the hell? I then hear more bangs, and now the doorknob is rattling. This time, whoever it was trying to open the door. Luckily, this building was old and disgusting. The landlord, the paint jobs, roaches, and no AC. But what it did have was 2 deadbolts and a door chain. So I felt more curious than scared. I took a look through the peephole and saw a blonde man. He didn't look like a junkie or a weirdo, but I also didn't recognize him. And no, it wasn't Mike. He was dark-haired, and he would have written a poem before he tried to break down a door. So feeling young, stupid, and for whatever reason safe enough to sleep, I go the hell back to sleep, but it keeps happening. Every night I go to sleep, and every single night he knocks. He bangs and slams the door. He jiggles the doorknob left and right. He yanks on the doorknob. He flies into the door with the weight of his entire body, and he never talks. He'd really suck as a SWAT officer, and for some reason I never call the cops. I think I was in my cab era. I don't know. It went on for about a week, but I do eventually call my friend Pete. Pete and I hung out for the day. Maybe for a bit of context, Pete looked like the sniper in Saving Private Ryan. Skinny, bony, and oddly serious. Pete couldn't hurt a fly, but he had a weird ghoulish face that made it seem as though he could. So we waited and waited. We plotted, and we constructed a plan. Speaking in whispers, we waited into the night. 1, 2, 3. And then again. There's knocks at the door. Go time. Out of the peephole, we see the blonde man. What a surprise. He continues to knock, smash, and bang. With the chain lock on, we undid the 2 deadbolts. The knocking paused. We flick open the doorknob, and with a knife in each of our hands, we start screaming. We stab IKEA kitchen knives through the gap. We switch the blades around like pirates, who are only allowed to carry butter knives. Screw off already. The blonde man stumbles back and then jogs down the hall. Pete and I just laugh our asses off at this. And to my surprise, the weird blonde man never returned. All it took was matching his craziness. I will never know why he targeted me, or why he was so freaking insistent on getting into my apartment. This took place in June of 2015. I was a 25-year-old female who had just finished college, and who took to the road to explore the western provinces of Canada. At this time, I found myself working odd jobs for cash in the province of British Columbia. If you're not aware, the Okanagan region of BC is a gorgeous place that has a perfect climate for growing fruit, especially cherries, apples, and wine grapes. In the spring, summer, and fall, tons of jobs open up for people to come pick fruit by hand, often living in camps in tin cities. I had just finished working on a farm in that region for May and June, and got a ride to Vancouver to catch a Greyhound bus east into Alberta to do some more exploring. I was traveling pretty roughly and unsafely. My cell phone had no service because I hadn't paid my bill in 6 months, so I was dependent on Wi-Fi to stay in touch with loved ones, and I had no credit card. I was dependent on working short-burst cash jobs to get by, and carried a tent, so I always had somewhere to sleep. My main means of travel were hitchhiking, ride-shares posted on Facebook groups, and Greyhound. I was trusting and somewhat naive, and to this day, I believe some angelic force or spiritual guide must have kept me from getting murdered because I took many stupid risks. And here unfolds one of my riskier decisions. The Greyhound ticket I'd booked departed at 7 in the morning the day after I got dropped off in Vancouver. I was getting dropped off around 5 p.m., and I was unable to find a place to stay because again I didn't have a credit card. My plan was to hang around 24-hour fast food restaurants or coffee shops near the Greyhound station in downtown Vancouver all night, charging my phone and chilling with my belongings until the wee hours of the morning when I'd walk to the Greyhound station. At this time, I was carrying a large backpacker's pack with a tent and a sleeping bag on my back, as well as a small backpack in front for small personal belongings, and I really didn't want to get robbed. I used my phone with coffee shop Wi-Fi to Google 24-hour businesses downtown, and it narrowed down a few. There were not too many, but I had at least one Tim Hortons and one Starbucks. The sun was beginning to set, and I remember I took a walk down to the ocean to watch the pink sky sing down behind the barges and boats in the bay. I was carrying all of my stuff, and it was quite heavy, so I took my bags off and rested on a bench. I remember feeling satisfied and peaceful. It started to get late, and I decided to walk to the 24-hour Starbucks that I'd found on Google to set up shop for the night. I wandered a bit and located the store. I ordered my favorite coffee at the time and got cozy on a bench at the window. It was now close to 10:30 p.m. I had plugged all of my devices in and was looking down at my phone when in my peripheral vision I saw a man enter the Starbucks. He orders a drink, and then I can see him, again in my peripheral vision, kind of curiously investigating me and my chaotic scene of bags and charging cables. He then sits on the bench next to me and starts up a conversation. He's probably about 5 feet 10 inches, built, short blonde hair, and attractive. I'm open, friendly, and trusting. We chat about what both of us are doing there at such a late hour. He told me he's a U.S. Coast Guard passing through Vancouver because he was relocating from Alaska to California. He then told me that he noticed me sitting on a bench on the beach hours before, which was at least a 30-minute walk from where we were. Suddenly, the Starbucks staff told us they were closing. It turns out they were no longer operating for 24 hours. It was almost midnight, and I realized I had to find another place to stay in downtown Vancouver. He asked me where I was going next, and I said I was going to look for another place to sit all night. He very kindly and generously offered to let me stay on the couch in his hotel suite until I had to get up at 4:30 a.m. to catch my bus. I felt I had no choice. I trusted him, and I went with him. It was a 5 to 10 minute walk from the Starbucks. He was staying in a small Chinese hotel with small dragon statues out in the front. He took me up to his suite on the second floor, and I dropped my bags in the living room next to the couch. We shared a few words, and he told me not to drink any of the water or soda in the mini fridge, or he'd get charged for it. I then curled up on the very small couch, and he went into his room. I didn't sleep well because I had to get up in a few hours at this point, and I was anxious about sleeping through my alarm. My alarm went off at 4:30 a.m., and I started gathering my belongings. I then went to the bathroom to brush my teeth and use the toilet. When I opened the door, he was out of the room. His attitude had completely changed from the night before. I don't know if he anxiously tossed and turned all night, regretting his decision to bring a strange girl into his hotel room, but he looked ready for a fight. His fists were clenched as he followed me around closely, and he kept saying, "Don't steal anything. Don't take anything that's not yours." I quickly gathered my belongings and left, waving and saying thank you as I went out the door. I walked to the Greyhound station, hopped on my bus, and headed farther east. To this day, I think about this tale often. I wonder if he followed me from the beach, or if it was truly a coincidence. I wonder what his intentions were. I wonder what made his attitude change. I wonder if he thinks about this too, and I wonder if I dodged a bullet. How wrong things could have gone. Either way, I've been longing to tell this story. Hopefully it entertains people. The story I'm about to write happened a few years ago. To describe the incident, I think I'll need to give some context first. I'm a 29-year-old male now. Back in high school, I had a crush on this pretty girl. Eventually, I asked her out, and we became each other's best friends. The story revolves around her father. Ever since we were together, I quickly realized he didn't like me much. He used to give me bling stares whenever we had dinner over at her house, and though I tried my best, he would always try to pick at me over something, even to the point of me dropping a single drop of rice outside of the plate. She and her mom were very apologetic though, and I learned quickly that her father was in the military and apparently developed some kind of mental disorder from his tour in Afghanistan, and so he was always groggy like that with almost every single person he met. He once told his daughter that even with me present, that such an ugly guy like me doesn't deserve a pretty girl like her. So in a way, I respected him, and I'm not going to lie, I always felt sorry for him. Hence, I tried to be naive about the things he said to me, and just ignored them. I thought he was just being overprotective of his daughter, and oh boy was he protective, all right. Fast forward to university. By this time, even though we had a couple of fights, she and I were still best friends and loved each other like crazy. By this time, she and I were doing side jobs and making enough money to afford our own apartment together, besides all the costs, and we decided to move out from our parents and start living on our own. Although my family were very happy seeing me move on, her transition was not so easy. At first, her father straight up denied her from moving out. However, thanks to her mom, she was finally able to move in with me despite him being very angry with me and at her over the entire ordeal. The problems began almost immediately after moving out. At first, he called my family, and he told them that apparently I'm this secret Satanist cult leader, and that I've lured his daughter away from him, as well as some other crazy stories. My family, who already knew about his mental health condition, assured him that I wasn't going to harm his daughter by any means, and that I love her more than anything, and that I would never let anything bad happen to her. This isn't even enough though. He called our university's office one day, screaming and demanding to know why she's not returning his calls, and that I've probably done something bad to her. This resulted in a very ugly scene of both of us being pulled from our classes to the uni office, and having to explain her father's conditions. Mind you, the reason she wasn't picking up the calls was because she was in the middle of class. In the meantime, something odd started happening with me in the middle of the night. Every night around 1 to 2 a.m., I started getting calls from an unknown number, but when I picked it up, I just heard breathing, no words, so I started ignoring them. Fast forward about a month, and she and I were out pretty late with some friends, and came home very late at around 2 a.m. When we were about to pull over into our house, we saw her father's car in the driveway, but as soon as she got out to see what's up, the car started to speed away. This left both of us completely in awe. She tried calling him, but instead her mom picked up, but she told us that she had just woken up and didn't see her father anywhere. She was also shocked to learn what we'd just seen, even though he denied it at first. It turned out every night after her mom fell asleep, he sneaked out and drove all the way to ours, apparently to protect his daughter from my evil deeds. Her mom also found out that he used a burner phone every night to call to my number as well, just to spook me out or something. Even though you might think this is the worst incident, unfortunately no, it's nowhere near it. After this happened, we didn't see or hear from him much, as her mom started staying up late and ensured us that he couldn't go out to us again. Fast forward a few nights without any phone calls or really anything from him, while one night we were sleeping on the bed, and then I woke up to something. At first I didn't realize what it was amidst the darkness, so when I went to get up from the bed, my entire body shook with fear and terror. I saw her father holding a large knife standing at our bedroom door. I was consumed with fear and tried to scream, but nothing came out. As soon as he noticed I was awake, he then ran and jumped on me, pinning me to the bed and started cursing at me, yelling things at me like I hypnotized his daughter. I took his baby girl away from him, and so on. Mind you, he's a huge military-trained dude, and I'm just some skinny, not very tall guy. And before I could react to anything, he started to cut on my throat with the knife right around when she woke up. I then started fainting, with her then letting out a blood-curdling scream. Well, that's the last thing I remember until I woke up in the hospital. She was right beside me. My neck suffered a small but quite deep cut from him putting the knife in it. I learned that as soon as she realized what was happening, she yanked the knife out of her father's hand, saving my life and immediately dialing 911. Apparently after her father did that, he just went to the corner of the room and sat there with his head down until the police arrived with an ambulance. Even though I was shocked to my core, I still feel sorry for him. He was in major need of mental assistance. Nobody understood it back then, and perhaps her moving out made it even worse. At the end of the day, I'm alive and well with just a bruise on my neck as a forever reminder of the incident. Her father has since been diagnosed with schizophrenia and getting proper treatment now, and he's doing better. And if you're wondering what happened to us after that, well, we just got married the previous year, and we're very happy. We still remember that horrible night, and we promise each other we'll keep each other safe at any cost. To preface this, I'm a female, 34 years old, and I live in a small town of about 12,000 people. It's pretty quiet for the most part, but like any other town, it has its bad apples. It's a rural country town, and a nearby area is known for having some unsavory characters, basically just crackheads and junkies. One night when I hadn't been living in that town for too long, I was sitting at home and remembered that I needed some cash to pay for my portion of the rent and utility bill money the next day. So I decided to make a quick trip to the bank that wasn't too far away. I was still a little unfamiliar with the town and where things were, but I had for sure seen a bank nearby. Once I arrived, I noticed it had been permanently closed. Well, damn, I remember seeing another bank on Main Street, so I set out to get some cash. I arrive at the Main Street location and pull around to the drive-through ATM. I roll down my window and place my card into the ATM reader. It's about 11 p.m., and where I live can be pretty dead at night, so it was quiet until I hear a dog barking, but the bark sounded off. More like a person mimicking a dog, but the bark sounded more like a signal to someone. It seemed strategic sounding, too rehearsed and human to be a dog. It made me nervous. I quickly scan in front of me. Nothing. I look in my rearview mirror. In the shadows, I see a scraggly shirtless man with something in his hand walking over a slight hill from the property behind the bank. I couldn't make out any distinguishing features, but I know a crackhead when I see it. He was heading towards my car. I quickly rolled up my window and spun around in my seat. He must have dug behind the building because he had disappeared in a split second. I surveyed the area around my car. Nobody. I felt uneasy, like every nerve in my body was telling me to get out of there. My card was still in the machine, so I couldn't just drive off. I nervously rolled my window back down and finished my transaction, all while still darting my eyes around searching for any signs of the barking weirdo. I then yanked my money and card right out of the machine and rolled the window up successfully. By this time, a car had just rolled up behind me in the ATM line. They had come up from behind the building, where I figured the old boy from earlier had ducked when I noticed him. I made one more glance in my rear-view mirror at them. It was dark, and their faces were masterfully obscured from my view. They knew to stop far enough back so that the light from the ATM line wouldn't show their faces, but I had a gut feeling who was in the car. I quickly pulled around to the front of the building and stopped my car. Sounds like a stupid move, but there was a method to my madness. I stopped so that I could get a better look at their faces in the streetlights, just in case crap hit the fan, you know? Almost as soon as I whipped around to the front of the bank, the car behind me whipped around too. They were on my tail in a millisecond, I knew they were going to follow me. They stopped on a dime right beside my car. You guessed it, Dogman and two others were in the car. They all looked over at me, surprised. I looked at them in the face, and they stared at me for an uncomfortable amount of time, but in actuality it was probably just a few seconds. They then immediately sped off, not even stopping at the stop sign. Busted. Looking back, I'm pretty sure that Barky was lookout, and the others in the car were just hidden from view. The bark was a signal that someone was at the ATM, so they would pull up behind the person, follow them, and either rob them at home or then ambush and carjack them at a light or something. I'm not a genius, but I'm thankful that I had the forethought to stop and make sure that I saw their faces. I feel like it really saved me from being robbed, or worse, that night. I guess they didn't want to be ID'd, which is fine by me because I didn't want to be their victim. The story starts with me failing to bring my big, energetic dog to the dog park at a reasonable hour. It's late at night, approaching 11 p.m., but she's going stir-crazy, and my girlfriend is very upset, so I decide to bring her over there despite how late it is. However, I still have work to do, so I foolishly decide to bring my laptop with me, to a remote area practically guaranteed to be empty at night. As I'm plugging away at my computer, a man in a Lakers windbreaker comes walking down the street, heading to the right. The entire time he's looking directly at me, even turning his head all the way around as he walks past. He finally gets about 50 yards down the road, where the gate to the dog park is. Suddenly he stops. He looks around, clearly looking up and down the road to see if there were any bystanders coming and weighing a decision. After a few moments, he opens the gate and starts walking right toward me. Seeing the geography of the park, you would realize immediately, as I did, that there was no conceivable way he could have been intending to come to the park before he saw me. There's absolutely no doubt that he's intending to mug me and steal my laptop. I'm not scared though. I'm angry and frankly offended that this guy thinks I'm an easy target, so I calmly stand up and walk over to one of the shovels lying on the ground that people use to clean up after their dogs. I dispassionately pick it up and walk back to where my stuff is. I square my shoulders, puff out my chest, and confidently sling the shovel over my shoulder. He's about 20 feet away from me at this point. He's still approaching me, but just slightly more slowly, and his posture seems a bit more doubtful, if that makes sense. So I call out to him, something like, "Hey, how you doing, pal?" Which I hoped was a good choice that would sound relatively normal, and not like a nerd trying to sound tough. I try to put as much menace as I could on it without sounding too cartoonish. I must have done a good enough job. Because of this, he stops walking. I'm expecting him to say something back, and I'm watching his hands, which are still in his pockets. And then without a word, he turns around and walks away. I know this might seem like I think I'm a badass or something, but that was the very first time anyone tried to mug me. I was all adrenaline and anger in the moment, but looking back on it, I'm really lucky how it played out. I'm not sure I could have actually beaten him in a fight, but I had a pretty dangerous looking shovel and was genuinely willing to use it, and I knew that he probably wasn't going to risk a trip to the hospital, or worse, just for a generic laptop. But I'm also really glad that he didn't pull a gun or a knife on me. Still, I'm really proud of my response. Around the summer of 2017, I was in my sophomore year of high school. I was with my two friends, Johnny and Devin, on a Friday night. I was Snapchatting my crush at the time, and she was telling me that she was having a sleepover at a mutual friend's house. My crush's friend was also hitting on Johnny, and they were telling us to come over for a little bit to hang out since there were no parents at home. Of course, being the hormonal teens we were, my friends and I were set on making it to the house before it got too late. We convinced Johnny's mom to give us a ride over to the house, but she told us that she wasn't going to be able to pick us up since she had to go to bed early for work in the morning. This didn't matter to us at all since we were just focused on being able to hang out with girls at night. After we spent time with the girls, the main girl who lived at the house told us that we had to leave since it was getting late and she wanted to sleep. At this point, it was around 11 p.m., and we were broke high schoolers, so the idea of getting an Uber was out the window. The three of us just accepted the fact that we were going to have to walk back to Johnny's house. The distance was less than 4 miles, but it was going to take an hour to walk. There was nothing really eventful that happened during most of the walk. We ended up stopping at a 7-Eleven because Devin wanted to get some beef jerky. Johnny and I waited outside the store, and we saw two sketchy-looking dudes outside staring at Devin while he was in the store. As Devin came out, beef jerky in hand, he turned and looked at the two guys, then looked towards us, smiling with his beef jerky raised up. Johnny suggested that we cross the street because the people were starting to walk towards us. We continued to walk across the street and looked every few seconds to see the same two guys walking the same speed at us on the other side of the road. I think they knew we were looking at them a lot because one of them began to make a slow two-tone whistling noise. About 3/4 of a mile from Johnny's house, we were whispering and trying to figure out a plan to make sure that these people didn't follow us back to his house. They looked across the road and the people were gone. This relief was short-lived as they appeared in an alleyway across the road with that same two-tone whistle. Then Johnny said a phrase that put me into a fight or flight position. They're walking across the street towards us. At this point, Devin and I also turned to see that the two guys were walking towards us. When they saw the three of us turn to look at them, they then began sprinting at us. I'm honestly glad that the three of us had the same idea, run. We all started running as fast as we possibly could, and I didn't want to stop until we got back to Johnny's house. I saw Devin drop his charger for his phone, and he stopped to grab it quickly, and then caught back up with us. I didn't even dare to look back at the two guys chasing us, but I heard them yelling at us and doing that same horrifying two-tone whistle. I was wearing these really beat-up low-top Vans that were destroying my feet with every cushionless step that I took. It didn't matter. All that mattered was running until I couldn't hear those people yelling and whistling. I'm not really sure if the two guys were just trying to scare us and have a quick little laugh. But after 2 or 3 minutes, they finally stopped chasing us, but we still didn't stop running. I remember Devin saying they stopped chasing us in between his gasps for air, and all I said back was just keep running. We turned the corner, and Johnny's house was less than 200 feet from us. Johnny ran faster, so he could get to the door first and unlock it. We threw ourselves inside, locked the door, and then ran up the stairs to Johnny's room. We all spent the next few minutes catching our breath and checking out the window to see if we could spot the two sketchy guys walking around. I'm very glad to say that we didn't see them again, but Devin showed me a picture of a pistol that he searched up on his phone, and then said, "This is what it looked like." When I went to grab my charger, I saw one of them with a gun that looked just like this. I'm not sure what is more bone-chilling, the fact that I was running away from two people with one of them having a gun, or the thought of turning around while running just to see a man with a gun running after me. I live in a relatively safe city in Scotland, though I have had several really scary and odd encounters since I moved here 4 years ago. I've been immersed in this subreddit for years before ever even creating an account, and to be honest, I learned a hell of a lot from all of the posts that I've read over the years. So I have what's not me to thank for my quick thinking. I'm a short 29-year-old woman, and I work in a pub, so I often get out of work quite late. On weekends, I usually head home at around 2 a.m. I never wear headphones when headed home at night, so this particular night was no different than usual. Alarms set, doors locked and checked, and said goodbye to my colleague, and then went our separate ways to get home. I usually cross a grocery car park to get home. It's well lit, and that night something struck me as odd. There were a couple of cars parked there, which is normal, but something just felt off. I looked over my shoulder and clocked a guy in a hat walking a distance behind me. This wasn't weird, but I decided to keep an eye on him nonetheless. I exited the park to the main road that I lived off of, but still had a good mile or so to go before I reached my flat. I checked over my shoulder again, and sure enough, this guy was walking the same direction as me. The distance between us was starting to close, so I decided to cross the road. I usually did at this point anyway. Looking over my shoulder, I was able to not only look for traffic coming, but I was also able to keep an eye on him. I crossed the road and didn't bother to look back for a few minutes, assuming he had stayed on the other side, but I began to hear footsteps approaching. I glanced over my shoulder and saw this guy was about 20 feet behind me now. I had a soft drink in my glass bottle in my back, and figuring I was overreacting, but better safe than sorry, I stuck my hand in my bag and gripped the bottle. Another 45 seconds, and this guy was now close enough to touch me, but he slows to my pace and then says, "Hi, how are you?" I ignored him, and I didn't respond. I long ago gave up on pretenses of being polite if I feel uncomfortable. A stranger's feelings matter less than my feeling of safety in any given situation, but he persists in talking to me. "Hi, are you going to work?" "No." I was being short with him. "Are you going home?" "Yes," I said coldly. "Do you live in this direction?" I just looked at him. He tried again. "Do you live off this road?" "Where do you live?" "Do you live close by?" I didn't respond and slowed my pace, letting him walk on. I was still gripping the glass bottle, ready to hit him with it should he try anything. He tried to slow down so I would catch up with him, but I slowed down so much that I was barely walking. He was maybe 300 yards away at this point, and simply stopped and turned around, watching me and waiting for me to catch up with him. I reached into my pocket with my free hand and tried my phone. Of course, my phone was dead. I figured it would last the walk home, but the dodgy battery had other ideas. Surprisingly though, I wasn't afraid. He had started walking again, but still quite slowly. He looked over his shoulder again after another minute, and I seized the opportunity. There was a path to a block of flats that was obscured by tall hedges, so I leaped behind them. I waited for nearly 10 minutes, never letting go of that bottle the whole time. I peeked around the hedges to make sure he was there. I peeked behind bins and bus stops to make sure he wasn't hiding in wait, but as far as I could tell, I had lost him. Maybe he didn't mean anything by this, but if you suspect a woman is afraid of you and she's walking alone at night, don't speak to her. It will not help. And especially don't ask her where she lives repeatedly. I wasn't drunk. I didn't appear to be drunk or need any help. I was just walking home as I ordinarily would. I am, however, inclined to believe that he had bad intentions. I would rather be too cautious than not, and this subreddit has definitely taught me how to do that. So for context, this happened a few years ago when I was 16. It was early August, and me and my best friend, both female by the way, were at my house and decided to go on a walk around 11 p.m. I've always lived in a really nice neighborhood where no crime really happens, however, I'm still extremely aware of my surroundings. We walked to a school near my house and decided to indulge in the devil's lettuce. Now this wasn't new to me, so although I definitely felt the effects, I wasn't out of it or anything at all. When we were done, we just kept walking. Eventually we were walking on the sidewalk opposite a pharmacy, which wasn't open at the time, so it was deserted, but I was kind of just staring over at it, and I saw some bikes around the corner of the building. As we kept walking, I kept my eye on it, and I noticed two big men who seemed homeless fiddling with the bikes. I could hear them angrily yelling, and it seemed the bikes were broken. It also seemed like they were on heavy drugs with how they were acting and yelling about the bikes. Then one of them looked up and started yelling at the other guy, who then looked up as well. We started walking faster as we were only about 30 feet away, and then the first man then yelled at his friend, "Hey, let's go get those bitches. Let's rape the shit out of them." Hearing this sent me into fight or flight mode. I grabbed my friend and ran to a nearby car wash and then hid behind a car. I could hear them muttering and looking for us, but I guess they were too drugged out to logically look for us. While running away, I called the police, who just now arrived, but by then the guys were gone. I never saw or heard about them again, but I'm so glad we ended up being fine. To anyone out there who likes to go on late night walks, always have your phone charged and always be aware of what's around you. This happened about a year ago when I was in my first year of university. For context, I'm from the UK and I lived in Students' Hall for my first year. It was in a flat with 2 boys and 4 girls, including me. There was a park nearby that we would often go to get some fresh air and sit at the swings and just talk about life and things in general. We were all very much night owls, so it wasn't uncommon for us to go late at night. One night, one of the other girls and I decided to go by ourselves as nobody else wanted to come. As you enter this park, there's a tall monument and some benches. We were walking along the path, and it was pretty much pitch black when a man stepped out of the darkness towards us. We jumped a little, but he was walking away from us, so we weren't too worried. However, we can be quite paranoid, so we kept looking behind us to check that he hadn't turned around and started following us. Turns out, this time we were right to be paranoid. After this, we made our way down to the swings and sat on them, with our backs facing the path that we had just seen the man on. I guess this was probably mistake number 2. Number 1 being going on a walk by ourselves late at night. After about 10 minutes, we looked back, and by one of the big trees further up the path where we'd initially seen the man, there was a small light, which we guessed was a phone flashlight, and it was shining directly at us. The light from the phone allowed us to see a figure standing by the tree. As soon as we both turned to look, the light went out. At this point, we really should have run, but we didn't.